Good afternoon, folks. Live from the McDowell sofa in Philadelphia. I'm back to read a little bit more of the chapter about swarm intelligence and flocks, herds, and schools. And I wanted to start off initially with a read aloud from one of my my series from the synthetic pretenders that I started this summer. And this was a very long 4-part sort of series within the series that was focusing on refugee labor and Internet of Everything and sort of smart living situations. And actually, the lack of receptivity to this particular post that I really spent a lot of time on, and I think is actually really foundational for understanding sort of the smart contract layer and social disruption and the role of faith-based institutions and governments in creating this sort of digital super consciousness, like using us as their human computers through sort of swarm intelligence and managed chaos and order through the refugee settlement systems is actually really foundational in the cyber physical infrastructure. So when I was when I put this out, I think it actually, I did it in July, early July of 2022. And it just was kind of like, again, throwing it in a hole. And I didn't really get much of a response on it. And actually somebody that I was really hoping to get feedback from, just like, actually several people, they just didn't make time for it. And so I'm here to say, this is really important. And so I'm going to go through and read this 4-part sort of mini series within synthetic pretenders for you guys, and then link it up to the swarm intelligence. But just in this context, sort of as the setup, I have been spending some time, and I ordered a second portable screen thing. Like, I'm so not that technical, but I'm trying to be a little bit more self-reliant with some of the stuff. And so I ordered a little secondary monitor so I can try to figure out how to do these live streams where I can share the screen and you can see the maps. So that should be coming hopefully later this week, and I can figure out how to do that. But in the meantime, I've been spending some time doing another map. This one is actually sort of spinning out, because what I usually do is find something that I find interesting. And then it's like, the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. You just kind of take those initial elements and then what connects to those and what connects to those, and sort of see what stories it tells. And so the centerpiece for this particular map was a presentation that was done in the offices of Nesta, which is in the UK and London. And they are one of the sort of primary social impact finance, behavioral conditioning entities. And they were hosting an organization called D-Cent. D and then cent as in like a penny, like D-CENT. And it was called Democracy Reboot. And it was linking sort of direct democracy, tokenized democratic participation with a digital currency. And it was in 2014. And one of the key individuals who was presenting there, his name was Bernard Leitaer, Lietaer. And he had a background in mechanical engineering and international finance, and actually was sort of a leader in developing the euro, but also these social currencies and complementary currencies. And so there were quite a number of people who were in the space at this event in 2014, which is pretty early in the sort of digital currency side of things. With Stacey Herbert and, who with Max Kaiser, sort of, the ugly Americans pitching, Bitcoin and that. So Stacey Herbert was on the panel, as well as people who were connected to community-based banking, but digital banking in Brazil and in Italy. And so I'm kind of unpacking all of this and just really realizing how much of this story, at least to me, a central feature of this story, it goes back again to this Enlightenment thinking, but not just the Fabians, right? Because the Fabians really had the bead on the eugenics as the science was ramping up to work on sort of genetic modification. But the Enlightenment thinking, really, it's this utopianism, right? It's this mechanical industrial era, a planned society, optimization of society that goes along with Taylorism and other things. And so, I think they want to use digital currency to achieve these pseudo-utopian programs. And as I mentioned the last time we talked about looking into the University College London, and that its spiritual father as a secular university was Jeremy Bentham, who was the political theorist who like developed the idea of the panopticon and was also really central in sort of quote unquote reform of the UK poor laws to make them really draconian, so nobody would want to actually um, avail themselves of public assistance because the conditions of that were really 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 awful. But he also advanced something called the philosophic calculus, which is this the idea that you can on any given action measure the amount of pleasure or pain associated with said action and its impact on society, with the understanding that somehow you would engineer society towards the maximum happiness for the maximum number of people. And I've touched on this in previous talks a bit with like Richard Layard and his authentic happiness program and the shift. And we'll get into this some in this series about refugees, but this idea that you're optimizing for some social benefit. And right now, all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are framed around, you know, saving the planet, solving poverty. It's all framed around public benefit. So it makes it very hard to contest when you want to just untangle yourself from the smart contract layer. They'll say, but it's for the public benefit, right? You have to. You can't get out of Google's web. You can't get out of the Web3 consortium. You have to stay in there because it's all for the public good. And that's the narrative that's been over and over and over again. Yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to me, someone was asking, like my email is teamsila, TIMPSILA @protonmail.com. Just shoot me a line. So Bentham was central, and he actually had his secretary and a close disciple and acolyte, and his name was Edwin Chadwick. And so Chadwick himself was one of the key people in so-called reforming poor laws and public health laws. And this was in 1834 and 1848. And, you know, it's interesting because I came across a really stark essay about Bentham and the poor laws and saying like, hey, by the way, they wanted to put like the children of the poor also into workhouses. This is workhouse culture. And I think we need to imagine what the future of digital workhouses looks like, and that they would want to put the children in digital workhouses with some education, which would be like training to fit into this society that would, you know, enable the workhouses. And even the play of the children was controlled in these spaces. And I've talked a bit about sport and my ideas of like harnessing children in their play routines with wearable technologies and sensor networks, and maybe including the apparatus like soccer balls, and using children's play to power the data-driven machine learning, right? For learning chaos, learning, you know, learning about what it is to be human. But even back in Chadwick's day, in the middle of the 19th century, he and Bentham were talking about this idea of, what did they called it? A sinking stage, that they would have the children and they would have it all measured out, like by how much they weighed or how old they were or how tall they were, to like come up with a cohort of children. And then they were allowed to run, but they had to run up this steep stage that was attached to like a counterweight that was like a bucket of water or something, essentially to create this piezoelectric energy, essentially to create an energetic transfer to run industrial systems. So the children, back in this idea of the pauper panopticon workhouse, even the children's play was harnessed into the machine, which, again, if you look at it, and I keep thinking, like, look at these no excuses charter schools, like, look at this plan to, you know, everything has to be earned. Every minute has to be accounted for. Nothing can be wasted. It all must go to collective happiness and well-being. That this is all sort of linked in with the map that I was making. And I think is very much in line with both the piece that I'm going to read about charter cities and refugee labor, and then later on the swarm intelligence. So so hopefully soon I will be able to figure out how to get a second monitor so that I can do the screen share and like walk you through these maps. But you know, and again, I'm making these maps in the machine itself because I think like Omedyar Network or something like sponsors the map software. So it's all like entangled with each other. But for now, this helps me think about it, and at least then I can share the links with you guys too, and I can add that later. So I'm gonna paste in. This is the post that I'm gonna read. If you want to follow along or look at it more closely later with the links, it's from July 11th, 2022, and Again, I'm reading it not because it's old to sort of justify like that I've been doing this for a long time, although my earliest research into the blockchain identity space was around these pre-K systems in South Africa, government sponsored pre-K, putting toddlers on blockchain for social credit scoring, or like they didn't call it that, but like, yeah, to earn social capital. And then it was also looking at the way in which the Syrian refugees were being managed as impact commodities on blockchain. So I have been working at this at least since 2017, 2018 on the blockchain identity, and the refugee part of the story has been consistent throughout. So anyway, so it starts off like I have an image central to this story. This series that I did is the Mondragon Corporation, which is one of the largest cooperatives in the world. It's based in Spain. It has ties to the Catholic Church. Although any of these faith-based institutions are going to be, enmeshed in all of this. I was looking today, this guy Lightyear, who's I think since passed, but he was writing a paper about like Sharia compliant digital currencies, in the global market. So all of the faith-based institutions are going to be woven into the smart contract layer, because really, religion is sort of the first civilizing social programming influence, like across the board and around the world. And that's how it goes. So I start off with sort of an image of Mondragon and the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can kind of picture there's like a round circle of the rainbow colors and their little logo in the middle. And they're talking about goal 1 of the UN SDGs is no poverty. So I start out. The next 4 posts started out actually as a single article for the Synthetic Pretender series. And that's the one that I was doing about the Berggruen Institute in California. But as I continued to dig and write, the content got a little out of hand. And if I were more self-disciplined, I'd probably be able to organize my findings better and perhaps offer up more compact and digestible posts. But there's a lot of background information provided here. So even though I cast a wide net, rest assured that it does ultimately connect back to SynBioEugenics, Berggruen's network, and California's social impact NGOs, which are joined at the hip with defense tech, global finance, and faith-based institutions. And then I made a PDF of the whole thing all together for people. And the first section I call Your Government as a Planetary Computer. When Nicholas Berggruen reestablished himself in Los Angeles in 2010, and he's like a billionaire financier turned philosopher king. In 2010, with an intention to train in philosophy, he sought out 2 mentors, both of whom were UCLA professors. One was Brian Esparza Walker, a researcher in comparative political theory and civic responsibility, who has been working on a new book on cybernetics and Confucianism. And the other was Brian Copenhaver, who is an expert in the belief in magic in early modern Europe and the Hermetica. Copenhaver's 2015 book, Magic in Western Culture from Antiquity to Enlightenment, looks very interesting, but it does come with a hefty price tag of academic presses. And so if you're interested in getting a sense of what he's all about, there are a few online talks with Copenhaver, and then I have links here and here. Can look at those. So this is what I keep bumping into. I know a lot of people had come into this space from a more occult or esoteric or metaphysical stances. And again, that wasn't my path. My path was simply like school closures. But once you spend time in these spaces, like you realize that these metaphysical systems are something that the people who are at high levels in the structure are really interested in. They're really interested in. And I think at what point does, alchemy and metaphysics, how distant is it from sort of high level, nanotechnology or theoretical physics? I mean, to me, at some point, they all start to seem pretty similar. So I have a link to Brian Copenhaver's podcast on the Hermetica. In lieu of payment from Berggruen, the 2 professors asked him to become a donor to UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. He ended up underwriting research at the Luskin School of Public Affairs on a good governance index and partnering with the Humanities Division on a lecture series aptly entitled Possible Worlds. And if you read between the lines of the tweets below, you can see how this governance index is infrastructure for outcomes-based contracts aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so I would just sort of reinforce here that when you see governance, I think we need to sort of swap out and think about governor, like the steering mechanism to be governed is like the like a mechanical governance system of steering us onto the right path, and that governance is Kubernetes, is cybernetics. And so, I mean, maybe it's not always directly applicable, but I think that the steering mechanism is something that we should keep in the forefront when we're talking about governance and governance indices and measuring good governance, because good governance is the governance that's going to steer us into Web3 and virtualization and sort of the world sensorium, this noetic global consciousness. I think that that's how we have to see it. Um, uh, and also just understanding that civil society and public affairs and good citizenship is increasingly going to be about aligning the population to the next level of civilization, which is this society 5.0, an avatar life. To be civilized, you will live as an avatar, right? To be civilized, you will share your data. To be a good citizen means to live your life in the panopticon and provide all that is extracted from your thought process or your biological process or your DNA into the master computer so that it can be optimized, right, to solve global problems. And the global problems are all these sustainable development goals, which are aligned with both poverty and people management and the management of people in relation to the environment, and then the environment itself. And the SDGs are the rules of the game, the rules of the cybernetics game. And I have had a few people like recently, and my earliest videos are about the sustainable development goals, but I think they must be understood as a structure and not an end in of themselves. Like if you trace something back to the UN and you go, oh, see, it's a problem because the UN is involved. I would say that's maybe not incorrect, but if you stop there and you just said, okay, I've got to the source of things, it's the UN, and therefore it's a problem. It actually is a way, like, I think the UN is kind of like Bill Gates, is a layer in which to sort of make people stop and then not look deeper into like the particulars of what that is. Like the UN can, like, if you point to the UN, then you don't actually have to look at your local university that's doing the thing, or your local business partner that's doing, stakeholder capitalism, or these other things that are actually not far away out there in New York or Geneva or Vienna, but that are literally in your own backyard. And so if you're always looking outward towards this sort of ambiguous entity that is like the World Economic Forum or the UN or Klaus Schwab, then fewer people are going to keep going with that level of inquiry and get down into the specifics of where you are. So I think that's something I just want to make clear. And initially that's where I was at too, but I think the UN plays a really important role in establishing the rules, establishing the parameters, setting up the metrics for the global impact management project. But then it's the structure, it's the armature, but the particulars of how it's all fleshed out are probably in your own communities. Okay, so remaking political systems for electronic government is the imperative, not only to ease the collection of data to prove progress towards the 17 goals, but also to build the global data economy, which in turn fuels machine learning for artificial intelligence. And that's everything that Ocean Protocol is working on. UN SDG 16 is called Strong Institutions. The governance index is overseen by Helmut Ankier, a German sociologist who specializes in social innovation. He splits his time between UCLA and the Hertie School, which is in Berlin, Hertie, Hertie School, one of Europe's first graduate schools devoted to public policy. The Hertie School promotes e-government digitalization as a means by which to steer behaviors towards sustainability through these circular economies. And I would say the circular economy is also, you should keep your ears out for the donut, the circular economy and the donut economy. Those are sort of, again, an economic system for the public good. And I'm not saying, again, that there's not something to the idea of we should have a right to repair, or we should have systems that are sustainable, or that we shouldn't be managing our waste better. Unfortunately, because of the power dynamics and knowing who's behind all of these things, like I'm in a city where, they offer recycle bank points, and yet tons of the recycling never ends up being recycled and it just goes in the landfill anyway, because structurally it's not set up to actually do it. There's a performative superficial layer that's used as the controlling mechanism, but the reality is that there are many of these sustainable circular practices aren't actually about fixing power imbalances or resource imbalances. It is about enacting a new phase of ubiquitous computing, spatial computing, synthetic biology in the name of organic, molecular, personalized, deglobalization, right? I mean, all of these things that are being sold as circular aren't actually accounting for the more significant problems. The people who want to sell you the next solution were the people who made the problems in the first place, and I don't trust their I don't trust their motivations. So then I have a tweet. This tweet was from June of 2022 from the Berggruen Institute. And it says, here, we're presenting our governance index, a landmark project from the Berggruen Institute and UCLA that will analyze why some countries fare better than others at providing a high quality of life. And that high quality of life, I think, is really important to consider because, again, that's going back to Bentham, the digital utopia, the panopticon, the contracts, Richard Layer's idea of authentic happiness, that happiness will be measured and calculated and indexed. And that in all of the documentation of this information and the indexing, embedded in that bubbling up is this idea of this sort of emergent information beingness that they're trying to manifest through massive amounts of metadata tagged interconnected information. So the governance index is supposed to sound like we're caring about things, but really a lot of it is about getting the data. Okay, so they talk about good governance and needing a data to talk about a democratic accountability. The democratic piece is going to be key, and I'll show this in my map later, but they want you to participate in democracy as an actor, as an agent, and they want you to participate through tokenized participation so the machine can see it. And then I think you the next phase is they actually don't want you to play with the tokens and they would like for you to cede your agency over to an agent that's authorized to act on your behalf in this radical participatory democracy. So that's where that is going, is the tokenized democracy. But they need for everyone to believe in democracy. And again, I don't know what the alternative is, but I can see that the entire scenario of the Trump, Biden narrative of like, we have to protect the democracy is about getting people to double down on the name democracy, although how it's going to manifest in the new Web3 era is not going to be what we imagine democracy being. Literally, it's going to be your avatar puppeting through some sort of aberration of what we imagine representative decision making actually is for the machine. So that's the tweet from the Berggruen Institute. And then I just have an image of Helmut Ankier, who splits his time between UCLA and Berlin. And again, if we're pointing fingers about like which country is in charge or who's doing what to whom, like we have to realize that the metaverse Web3 is a global construct, and that all of these actors, whether they're at a government layer, whether they're at the academic layer, a research layer, a corporate layer, they're all going to be multinational, because that's what the metaverse is. It is a multinational global project. And then I have a screenshot of the UN and their curriculum on governance for sustainable development, because all of the governments have to be aligned with the goals, because it is sort of the new world order. It's just coming online. And so so this goes back to the blog. A network emerged from the proceedings of Berggruen's Think Long California Committee. That was a group that he set up, Think Long California, whose scope of work quickly expanded well beyond the Eureka state, that's California, to include international bridge building. In its first few years, the Berggruen Institute established relationships with leaders in the EU, and they sent delegations to work with Chinese officials and industry leaders. So again, pointing fingers, right? Who's doing what to who? Are we doing it to China? Is China doing it to us? Like, no, everybody's doing it to everybody. So they're going to the EU, they're going to China. Berggruen never was focused just on California. California was the launching pad for the the spores, the fungal spores to go everywhere afterward. Okay, so let's see. So they're in EU in China. A year after the blueprint to renew California, that was the document. The blueprint to renew California went public. Nicholas headed over to Berlin for a European town hall, and it was co-hosted with the French economist Jean Pisani-Ferry and Jakob Kellenberger, a Swiss diplomat who was working in the international humanitarian aid space. And both of those people were members of his Berggruen network. And then I say disruption, displacement, and the solidarity economy. At that event, speeches were given by Minnesota native and former Prime Minister of Greece, George Papandreou, and the former UK Prime Minister and big data social entrepreneur, Tony Blair. And then George Soros took the opportunity to chastise the greedy creditors that precipitated the Eurozone crisis and decry the refugee situation in Greece and propose a new era in which solidarity community centers would be established to manage the masses of people flowing into the debt-crushed country. In 2013, his foundation, Soros's, launched the Open Society Initiative for Europe to promote democracy and human rights, with a special focus on refugees. And then 3 years later, he pledged $500 million for social impact initiatives targeting displaced people. And so I have to say, now, I see someone is like, we have to protect the Constitution. I would say, like, again, think about it, guys. What I'm just saying is that this is a global initiative. Like, at the one hand, while I imagine that people want to imagine that they can protect their borders and that sort of thing, actually what's being pitted against, it's AI versus natural life on the entire planet. And we actually do need solidarity with all the people around the planet, because the people who are like, I mean, my understanding is, like, as a Philadelphian and the home of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, is that the people who developed that were the people of the Enlightenment. They were the scientists. They were the enlightened, European-leaning scientific people who were there to protect their interests, which were predominantly landed men, right? And so we've been told a big story about the Constitution. I'm not saying just throw it all away, because clearly they would love to usher in whatever they've been planning with their smart contract, international arbitration. But I think we have to be realistic, is that if we're looking back to Enlightenment thinking and scientism and all of that, whatever the people outside the simulation are like fast forwarding it, like they knew where it was going to get to. And that they knew that eventually, like in the name of, whatever, human rights, technological progress, we would all be moving into this tokenized arbitration program. And so, like, I think we just need to realize that, like, what's at stake here isn't, American exceptionalism, but actually life. And that what's coming with the globalization, this globalization 4.0, the remote robotic labor with no labor protections, is like, I don't think we want to live in a world where somehow we win globalization 4.0 and we can make other people's kids in other parts of the world do telerobotic labor while we're all protected. And ultimately, I think the people in the countries with the highest cost of living are going to totally lose out if that happens, right? Like if they pull the bottom out and like everybody's on some uneven playing field and there's automatic natural language processing and anybody can compete with anybody for some robot job, people with expensive standards of living are going to lose out. I mean, they're already losing out on these remote work platforms, right? Without even the remote robots going there. So like what I'm saying is, I think in this moment, we actually have to have this bigger reckoning. And then like, especially as Americans, because a lot of this is empire. I mean, whether you imagine the empire is the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the British Empire or the US hidden empire, like there's a lot of imperial, like I call them the digital conquistadors. Like there is this imperial domination principle going on, not just with people, but also nature, because they want to coat everything in nanodust. So just as an aside, like that's why I really feel like this narrative, it's like, what story are we occupying? And I'm trying to say, like, actually, for people of faith, it's the least of these, which dispossess people who are often dispossessed for reasons of that it's profitable to dispossess people, to blow up their countries, to seize assets, to destabilize, and then use those dislocated people as assets in the social impact finance space. Like that's the thing we have to understand, because the plan is to dispossess all of us ultimately, like once they get that capacity and they really get all of the surveillance tech locked in. is that we actually have to empathize with the plight of refugees and understand how they're being pawns in all of this, and how the people coming ostensibly to their aid, like Soros, right? Like Tony Blair, like, who are coming out and saying, oh, we care for you. Like, we're here to care for you. Well, if you cared, like, we would not be creating vast populations of refugees. We would just let people stay where they are, because rather than blowing them all up, or, creating weather systems and things that dispossess them. So anyway, hopefully you understand what I'm trying to get at, but we need to, like, that's why I keep going back to children, refugees, nature, because eventually, yeah, middle class, professional class, Western Europe, global North will get sucked in. But if we don't actually look at the lessons, like, of both indigenous peoples, dispossessed peoples, the global South, like, we're going to be missing a lot, because we have a lot to learn. So, okay. So, and yeah, so we're just to be clear, we're not try to stay on task. Okay. Like, just try to stay on task. All right. So this is some different stuff, and it's important. Okay. So Soros is like, here I am. I'm going to give 500 million for a solidarity economy. This is a quote from the speech. Our goal is to harness the private sector for public good, Mr. Soros said. It's always for public good. We will invest in startups, established companies, and social impact initiatives, and businesses started by migrants and refugees themselves. So they're very interested in training up dislocated people to be entrepreneurs, but often in the digital space to create the metaverse. These investments are intended to be successful, but our primary focus is to create products and services that truly benefit migrants and host communities. I hope my commitment will inspire other investors to pursue the same mission. Okay, so entrepreneurship is key, and wraparound services. And then what I'm going to be trying to convey is that refugee settlements and relocations are often places where they can relatively cheaply template the digital identity stuff and smart infrastructure, right? The retinal scan housing, retinal scan grocery payment systems, EdTech for the kids, for their kids' education, maybe smart sporting items. Like, they're in those refugee communities, they can do that. And then they can uplift certain people who fit the bill for their branding and promotional needs as refugee entrepreneurs. Oh, look, this person can work from anywhere. They can build a whole huge business in doing AI, tagging photos for AI vision, machine vision right there from the refugee camp. Isn't this amazing? Like, and then they'll uplift these entrepreneurs, like refugee entrepreneurs. And so that's the program that's coming. In the image below, taken from the Berggruen Institute's website, Nicholas is seated next to Ursula von der Leyen. At the time, von der Leyen was the Christian Democratic Union, which is center-right, member of the Bundestag representing Hanover, and Minister of Labor and Social Affairs. The year after that town hall, Merkel appointed her Minister of Defense, and then she became president of the European Commission in 2019. Her husband, Heiko, founded the Hanover Clinical Trials Center. He specializes in cardiovascular gene therapy and has held leadership positions at several biochem firms. Okay, so we've got the biotech. All right. The issue of solidarity seems to be one of growing scholarly interest, which gives me the feeling that social integration of migrants may be being set up as a social impact investing opportunity. And that is not unlike anti-racism and racial equity metrics in the US. If you want to read more about my concerns about equity dashboards, I wrote an open letter to Ibram Kendi about it in the summer of 2019, and I linked to that. Academics are parsing the differences between offering needy people charity and solidarity, examining how that distinction plays into the dynamic of EU politics. Seeing that, my first thought is that this is a narrative being spun to position solidarity as the preferred method of immigrant support, where asylum seekers can be empowered to work off their reskilling and social care costs with impact investments tracked against their future economic output. That is the setup for career impact bonds former Goldman Sachs executive Phil Murphy has been pitching with social finance in New Jersey. Okay, so I hope that that's clear about the way in which they're going to tag refugees, and they can, right? Because once you're relocated, you're enmeshed in all of that paperwork. And then the services that you get it's not exactly charity, right? It's going to be kept on your permanent record, and then you can work that off over time. And so it's a heightened level of indebtedness, of digital indebtedness. And if you think back to what I was saying about Bentham and his co-workers, these poor laws were that you had to be in a poor workhouse. You had to work off the benefits that you were given. There was no charity. It was all work-based. And so I think what they're going to come, the narrative that's being built, solidarity, not charity, right? Oh, you can, we respect you. We respect your skills and your labor, and we'd love to let you work, right? And so you can pay off your children's school fees. You can pay off, the what it costs for your housing. You can pay off your food. We will just keep tabs on this permanent ledger. And that's what was set up in Syria with the Syrian refugees. But there are equivalencies because it's the exact same infrastructure in New Jersey with the career impact bonds, where they were saying, like, you can just add your social welfare services, like your childcare costs, to your tab of your reskilling. The OECD, which stands for the Organizational for Economic Cooperation and Development, with funding provided from the EU, they launched something called the Global Action Promoting Social and Solidarity and Economy Ecosystems. And they did that in 2020 to begin to address income inequality exacerbated by COVID lockdowns. Or to put it another way, the time had come to create the data architecture needed to channel these global ESG capital flows through the human misery. That effort is being chaired by Secretary General Matthias Cormann, a Belgian-born and educated politician who was previously affiliated with the German and French-speaking Christian social parties in Europe, before he relocated to Western Australia and rose to become finance minister with the Liberal Party of Australia. Prior to that, he had been working in the health insurance industry. Cormann, a conservative with a free market outlook, met with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken last June to discuss the post-COVID recovery, climate change, international tax reform, and management of the risks associated with digital transformation of the economies of market-based democracies. Okay, so especially the religious-oriented parties and these liberal parties, they would like for people to be on blockchain so that they could provide solidarity help managed on the ledgers as impact markets, right? And so again, it's not just the conservatives, it's the conservatives and the liberals. The intent, I believe, is to transform all of these so-called solidarity economies, but substantial education will be needed. Those targeted for the first round of this program, this first round of the hard sell, are the following countries: Canada, Brazil, South Korea, Mexico, India, the United States, and the EU. Now, Canada, Mexico, and Korea comprise 3 of the 10 digital nations. And what they were proposing was that they would have peer learning programs and conferences to instill a desire in local leaders to develop these legal frameworks and the impact metrics to scale the solidarity economies. Okay. So then in 2021, the OECD developed a working paper, and this paper was called Social Impact Measurement for the Social and Solidarity Economy. And it had input from Catherine Clark, and she is with the CASE Center for Social Entrepreneurship at Duke. Lisa Hehenberger, who is a management professor at ESADE, ESADE, and Jeremy Nichols, a leader in the establishment of social impact metric values in the UK. Now, this document emphasized the need to shift to outcomes-based reporting tied to procurement and enforcement regulations, addressing the lack of common measurement standards and issues of credibility, opportunities for the government and foundations to finance rigorous data collection, and getting buy-in from employees. All of this data will be used to keep capital flowing, even as its collection normalizes ubiquitous digital surveillance for surreal simulations run through Taylorist optimization protocols to stave off climate catastrophe and mass social unrest. That is the story they'll tell us anyway, to justify our dehumanization and the imprisonment of nature through blockchain financialization. Okay, so again, they're setting up the impact metrics. They're calling it solidarity. Everything runs on data, and the data is ultimately about surveillance. Okay, and then I have a screenshot from that document. The origins of social impact measurement for the social and solidarity economy ecosystems. It says, although the term social impact measurement has only recently gained popularity, its development can be linked to earlier efforts to identify, monitor, and foster social progress resulting from public and private actions. Yeah, and that goes all the way back to Bentham in the 18th century or late 18th, early 19th century. Social impact measurement practice today builds on and extends these practices in novel ways, no kidding. But it's not a brand new phenomenon. The degree of emphasis placed on it, the range and sophistication of methods for conducting it, and the breadth of actors now embedding it as a daily activity are what is striking about the current state of social impact measurement. So again, it is it goes back several centuries, but now new and improved with novel data collection methods, which is Web3 and digital identity. So who knows? They may even fancy it up by positioning contingent laborers as cooperative members. And yeah, they always want to make it sound good. Join our cooperative of the workhouse. Envision pop-up refugee communities, enclosures of dispossession reframed as collective businesses where residents are made token shareholders, living under the rule of smart contract law with enforced participation metrics for a governance scheme they never wanted to be a part of in the first place. And I think, again, we can go back and think about the prison labor, a lot of the United States. I mean, that's how, well, at various entities, right? I mean, that was the whole Reconstruction era. The people who were freed from slavery oftentimes were pulled into prison labor programs. And then again, the war on drugs, often like that was a global labor management program so that those people can be put into prison and used as prison labor. So the prison labor, the workhouse labor, the managed labor is huge in understanding it within the context of planned automation in the fourth industrial revolution. But if they can sell it to us as cooperative liquid democracy participation, at least the people listening to NPR will tolerate it better, I guess, if that's the story they can sell to us. So charter cities as containment zones for remote refugee labor. My suspicion is part of the plan to manage the transition to the fourth industrial revolution era of automation will be to disrupt social structures across the globe through economic and military interventions. Remove people to different locations where they have no support network, and then set up ad hoc charter cities where they will be leveraged as human capital commodities and trained to build and defend mixed reality Internet of Everything infrastructure, right? So they have to tear everything down, tear all of the social systems down, tear up the fabric of social society, and then give us tokens and tell us to rebuild civic participation, as long as it's machine readable. Displaced people aren't to be blamed. No one wants to be forced out of their home and culture. The average length of stay in a UNHCR camp, the United Nations, humanitarian systems, is currently 5 years and under terrible conditions with very limited rights and economic opportunities. Yet issues of asylum tend to center the challenges of meeting the needs of individuals and families, balanced against economic and social impacts on host communities who are often suffering under conditions of austerity themselves, rather than interrogating the systems that led to mass displacement in the first place. And so I feel like, again, refugees are being pitted against domestic populations, and that's on purpose. And again, there are communities who are like, we can't take any more people. We can't actually take care of the people we have, and we don't know what to do. If you give us this unfunded mandate to take care of refugees, we can't absorb that many more people, right? That was the problem with Greece. And so, but no one's looking to see why are we having 10 times more refugees than ever before, because it's a structural problem. And they're not going to fix, the global impact management people aren't going to fix the structural problem. They're just going to ameliorate and manage the social systems analysis of the dynamic between the refugees and the host populations. Okay. I believe that millions of people are being pressured to be on the move because it serves the interests of power to normalize biometrically managed social instability as the disruptive potential of Web 3.0 materializes. Last year, the Charter Cities Institute prepared a white paper proposing their solution as an improvement over the current horror of refugee camps where families may languish for years. And in the introduction, the author Sarah Doyle states that data from the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees indicates the number of displaced people has almost doubled over the past decade, from 43 million to 80 million. Each of those people is a potential impact opportunity for global investment portfolios. Markets in human capital improvement are created by trauma resulting from war and the breakdown of civil society. And that is the simple, honest truth. And then I have an image of the report, how charter cities can create better refugee responses. And it's quite stark. I mean, they have a tent city. It looks like it takes up maybe 10 city blocks in the middle of a desert. And I just can't imagine spending your life that way, right? The Charter Cities Institute pitches their planned communities as a better option to UN-managed camp life because they would open up settlements to economic activity and thus pools of millions of desperate potential workers. Okay, so think about this from a labor standpoint, okay, and a gig economy micro work. This approach also creates investment opportunities for public-private partnerships, which are touted as a way to offset costs for host countries desiring to stay in compliance with the 1951 Refugee Convention. Though they speak of P3 investment in terms of local entrepreneurs, the reality is that residents of charter cities will most likely be working on the Web3 build-out. It's not about supporting the creation of one-off mom-and-pop businesses. The excerpt from the Charter Cities Institute paper below brings in language of the collective and cooperatives with the additional element of female empowerment, since gender equity is UN Sustainable Development Goal 5. What this looks like is tokenized plural voting, not what most people understand as participatory democracy. Okay, so this is a quote from that Charter Cities report. Collective ownership and cooperative groups constitute the social and economic parallels to participatory governance in refugee charter cities. Land trusts, housing cooperatives, and what the International Labor Organization calls social and solidarity economy enterprises and organizations create opportunities for refugee ownership and inter and intra-community social and economic relationships. In partnership with the IKEA Foundation, the pop-up furniture assembly people, UNCHR has already implemented livelihood cooperatives across the 5 Dolo Ado refugee camps in Ethiopia that seem to be popular among both refugees and host populations. Charter cities can also build on existing collective structures in local communities, which can be especially helpful for women refugees who face higher barriers to economic activity. For example, Dr. Holly Ritchie, founder of the refugee women's empowerment social enterprise Thrive for Change, pointed out that mutual aid networks have been particularly important for refugee women during COVID-19. Overall, there is a strong need for both a normative and an empirical perspective to center refugee voices in the design of governance, business practices, programs, and institutions. The policy paper closes out with a call for accurate measurement and evaluation, and that's for the impact markets. Okay, so I think it's important to consider the idea of refugee camps being these holons, being incubators for, the holon being the border of the circle, the cybernetic circuit between order and chaos, right? They create some sort of managed order. They herd people into these spaces, and then the existing society is around the edge, and then they're tracking the social exchanges through this tokenized participatory democracy through sometimes universal basic income or these refugee currencies inside the system. And it's not necessarily high tech, because Leo has done quite a bit of work around this, of looking at like global south deployment of these digital currencies. And you don't even need a smartphone. You could just have a phone number, and then it syncs up when you get to a place that has connectivity. So it's not necessarily super high tech, but I think that they're using these refugee spaces as petri dishes for the tokenomics, participatory democracy, and social engineering, because they're smaller and it's easier to manage than in cities like mine, where it would be really hard to retrofit it all. Blockchain collectivism and the Mormon Transhumanist Association Conference. So below is a clip from the blockchain themed March 2022 Mormon Transhumanist Conference. in which I ask Curtis Lockhart, who is the head researcher for the Charter Cities Institute, how he reconciles the use of digital identity and sensor networks to track behaviors within smart urban environments, with his advocacy for high-tech communities managed through public-private partnerships. How will the concept he's promoting avoid the creation of DAO, decentralized autonomous organization company towns, run on behavioral script? And I mentioned that Foshan in China has been using blockchain to track the behaviors of individuals across the city. And that's it. That's about blockchain tracking of people who are on parole. The model that Mr. Lockhart has envisioned for scaling charter city development was China's complex network of special economic zones. So the Charter Cities Institute was at the Mormon Transhumanist Conference. They're pitching this. They're pitching the charter city tracking system, these special economic zones, as the model. But he's not really talking about how the surveillance built into the blockchain identity sensor networks will coincide with the idea of a free democracy, and he's not really able to answer that. The charter city idea was expanded on later that day by Tom W. Bell, and he is a faculty of the sorry, getting a little cloggy here. Tom W. Bell, who is on the faculty of Chapman University's Fowler School of Law, and he advises on special jurisdictions. He logged in from Prospera, which is the West's first charter city built as a platform for sustainable development and is located on the Honduran island of Roatan. Bell's talk was on ULEX, a standardized blockchain legal system perfect for sustainable automated cities of well-managed human capital. Okay, so I would encourage people to look up Prospera in Honduras, Tom Bell, this idea of ULEX. Essentially, they were talking about shopping carts of smart contract law systems, legal systems. And I believe what they're trying to set up is sort of a state of exception, right? I see up there, someone says like sources on the New Jersey program, the career impact bonds. Just look up social finance, Phil Murphy, career impact bonds, New Jersey. It will all come up. There's a lot of material on that. Okay, so just going back to the blog post, Vinay Gupta of Materium, and he was written up in my last blog post about the Crypto Skeptics conference. He describes himself, he was also at the conference, as a humanitarian turned technocrat. He presented remotely on fair trade as spiritual liberation. And at the end of the day, a young Lisbon-based scholar, Bernardo Vicente, also presented on the application of something called Harbor Georgist principles, which are novel forms of property ownerships to governance in sustainable cities. Now, various interest groups are working diligently to get all of the parts of this system up and running. Now, I sense it will take more manufactured disruption before things really start to scale, but I would definitely keep my eyes on Ukraine being used as a case study for decentralized digital systems engineered society. Okay. So again, you've got state of exception, you've got automated contract law, you have new theories of property ownership in smart, sustainable cities, and you have this idea of spiritual liberation through, living out our values through tokenomics and, micro insurance tracking. These are all things that are sort of coming together. But again, this idea of the state of exception, which the refugee communities are central to. So Paul Romer's vision opens the door to sustainable ESG finance. NYU and former World Bank economist Paul Romer's vision for geofenced state of exception towns fell out of favor after an unsuccessful campaign in Honduras, but it seems to be making a slow comeback. A former Russian energy lawyer doing consulting for the state of Vermont, Roman Sidorsov, prepared a paper called Sustainable Charter Cities, the Development Solution to Environmental Problems, when he was a global fellow at the University of Vermont's law school back in 2011. Sidorsov began his paper describing how he and his wife were inspired to create a humanitarian NGO after listening to a national public radio program about women and children brutalized at the Chad-Sudan border. He then pitched charter cities as an effective solution to human misery that would also meet the needs of ESG impact finance portfolios. To Sidorsov's way of thinking, charter city investments would generate profit, not unlike and that is different than traditional humanitarian assistance. So if you can set up a refugee encampment as a charter city, you could create profit out of it by aligning it with social impact finance. According to his Michigan Tech bio, Sidortsov he teaches courses in alternative energy and climate policy. Um, it defies logic that he would embrace Romer's proposal, which entails building enormous cities the size and density of Hong Kong from scratch in developing nations on uninhabited tracts of coastline. Okay, so that's like really strange to think about. Like, so these people who are Paul Romer, his idea for the charter cities would be that you would find large blocks of uninhabited land on the coast to build them, like dense cities like Hong Kong on coastal areas. So there's some inconsistency there, right? If you can't both believe in the need for immense social change because of the threat of climate catastrophe and flooding, coastal flooding, and then also say that you're going to solve these problems by building giant cities on the coastline. Like, that is inconsistent. The Charter Cities Institute has been collaborating with the United Nations on sustainable global development per a 2019 webinar with Richard Bolgwin, who is the head investment researcher with UNCTAD. The image below is taken from the website of the UN-affiliated International Organization for Migration and links migration to the achievement of Agenda 2030. So, like, they want a lot of people moving. It is important that we recognize displaced people as victims of the planned transition to an automated surveillance data economy, one that will center remote work. No amount of border control can mitigate erosion of wages once these blockchain skill lockers and haptic robotic telepresence labor becomes acceptable. Each of the squares below represents an opportunity for billionaires to use technological systems to process other humans, including children, as digital commodities. Every heading is an intentionally unattainable goal meant to keep the masses on treadmills or pathways of prescribed self-improvement, optimized for machine learning data harvest. Immigrants are not the threat. BlackRock's ESG portfolios are the threat. Okay, so this is a screenshot, and it says explore the interrelations between the 2030 agenda and migration. And these are all areas that they think that they're going to get their data from, right? Number 10 is reduced inequality. Number 1 is no poverty. Number 2 is no hunger. Number 3 is health and well-being. Number 4 is education. Number 5 is gender equality. Number 6, I can't quite see. It looks like water, maybe. Like, it goes on and on. Decent work and economic growth, climate action, partnerships for the goals, water, peace and justice, living on the land. These are all things that they say that they're going to solve with migration. But in moving people around, you get them on pathways of you create the chaos that you need for the chaos and order, and then you get them tracked with their digital identities, and then you create the impact markets, and then you create the data for this emergent world sensorium. And then I just have an image that talks about the ESG finance at BlackRock. And then I have an image in, I don't know if it's in Honduras, it's in Latin America. It's a person, a worker has this smartphone that's doing an iris scan, literally like on like this pole, like it's a phone on the end of a pole that's taking this guy's iris scan. And this is for contactless biometric payment. And it's this Iris Guard iPay. And so it's just so upsetting to see like how dehumanized this is. But they need for people to be in motion. They need for the chaos to both get the data and to make their money in the impact markets. An example of immigrants being targeted for pay for success finance is the Massachusetts Pathway to Economic Advancement. And that is piloted by JEBS, which is the Jewish Vocational Service, in 2018, in partnership with Macomb Capital's Community Outcomes Fund, Prudential Financial, which is a major player in New Jersey, and the Kresge Foundation. Digital identity is a way to profile and cream compliant immigrant labor. It is easy to see how such programs would be incorporated into charter cities where people may have to earn release into the general population through demonstrations of social impact compliance over time, right? And so, one of my own personal experiences being in Philadelphia is like we actually are, we were supposed to be sort of an asylum city, but our city was also one of the main centers for deportation under ICE. And so like there was an inconsistency there. And actually, like we're a city that's very much enriched by immigrants, and we are a city of immigrants. So, but we're also a center, and I was part of a group that was protesting both the deportations, the ICE deportations, because like I know, like once you know what the actual plan is through remote labor, like the idea of people's physical bodies and where they are, it doesn't matter so much. Like none of the conservatives are going to protect their jobs by securing the border, because the border is literally your house, like your doorbell. The new border is your geofencing attached to your digital identity. So the immigrants are not your problem. It's the structure itself, this machine structure that's seeking to like, you know, consume life to create the simulation. But nobody can listen to that because everyone needs to be in their boxes, right? Their polarized boxes. So in this, our mayor, Jim Kenney at the time, he came and he was doing his whole like pro-Democrat, anti-Trump thing at this immigrant, an uplifting, a celebration of immigrants at on the Penn's campus. And it was actually Zeke Emanuel's like center. And, you know, I went because we actually, not in Philadelphia, but several hours outside, we have one of like 4 family detention centers. And essentially it's a prison for families, including children. And like, they wanted to make it all about Trump and the border. I'm like, yeah. But in our state, it actually is the Democratic governor, Tom Wolf, who could address the issue of this family prison, immigrant prison, and isn't, right. And I said this out loud. I sort of interrupted this event at Penn with our mayor and all of these people around us who were like, you know, with the Center for American Progress. And it was all about the good immigrant. Like that was their story, is they wanted the good immigrants to do the things that they wanted them to do, which is to serve the system how they're supposed to serve. Right. And I, you know, I found out shortly thereafter that there's a whole division of pay for success finance that's centering immigration. But again, that allows you to control the immigrant populations very closely. And yeah, they were having none of that. Like, and all the Democrats were really pissed at me for pointing out this inconsistency with trying to make this polarizing border discussion like a conservative only or a Trump only conversation. And it wasn't actually, because specifically in our community, it was being run by the Democrats, because the Democrats want to manage immigration the way they want to manage it, which is to manage it for social impact finance. And, you know, to manage their families, to manage the business, to push entrepreneurship, all of which is going to be feeding the 4th industrial revolution. So, yeah, that was like one of my experiences about like running into this way in which immigrants were being managed for impact commodities, while at the same time they were setting up these fraudulent narratives that were keeping people stuck in certain mindsets that were never going to enable them to process what was really coming and is coming very quickly. Okay, so the idea is that purpose-built communities would be open to anyone agrees to opt in to these charter cities. Okay, so you've got these state of exceptions. You've got charter cities. Oh, look, you can choose to be in our charter cities. Refugee, would you like to stay out here or come into our nice charter city, right? And it's a state of exception. A refugee camp, charter city, is a state of exception. And these charter cities, literally, they're setting up campuses, like creating their own separate governance systems within the sovereign borders of nations. And they could just set one up wherever they want. So they would be run by private managers. Okay, these charter cities would be run by private managers and embrace Romer's new economic theory of technological innovation, guided by meta rules. And of course, the presumption is that all people actually have a free choice in the matter, and that is disingenuous. In a 2010 interview with the Center for Global Development, Romer laid out a variety of scenarios, including the use of charter cities as immigrant containment zones. And this is a quote: Brazil could be the guarantor and the host, but Haiti could be the source. If Brazil has already made a major commitment to providing security for Haitians in Haiti, they are the main supplier of troops and police officers in the force that entered Haiti under a UN mandate in 2004. To have a credible exit option, Brazil might consider chartering a new city on empty land in its territory that could accept Haitians as residents of the new zone, while maintaining standard immigration procedures for the rest of Brazil. This could give Brazilian forces in Haiti a way to leave, even if there is little progress towards stable governance. Brazilian leaders might say to the Haitian elites, We will spend several years trying to help you return your government to a point where it can provide essential state services like public safety. But if by then it still can't serve this function and things go back to where they were before we came, back to a situation where crimes like kidnapping were common and the police couldn't enter zones controlled by gangs, we will leave. But if we leave, we will also give Haitians the option to move to a special zone in Brazil where we will provide the basics of good governance. Okay, so it's just incredible to me that that is where they're going, right? It's pretty incredible. Okay, so the charter city models involve up to 3 parties: the host nation that provides the land, the source nation that provides the people, and the guarantor nation that enforces the charter. From the passage above, one can imagine where the United Nations peacekeeping fits in. Once installed in new settlements, displaced people would become impact commodities, suitable for training as gig economy remote work. That makes sense given the push by UNICEF Innovation to educate, so-called, the children of the global south through VR headsets and condition them for a future of telerobotic labor. There are already many coding boot camps that target refugees and immigrants for training into low-skill TaskRabbit-like work in the tech sector, including Coding Dojo, Dev Mountain, RefCode, and Namal. So then I have something rotten in the state of Denmark. In a June 2021 Charter Cities Initiative podcast, the Jordan Compact and the economic upside of locating refugees in special economic zones is explored. While Denmark has taken an increasingly hostile position towards asylum seekers in recent years, we see developments like the tunnel project in Lolland that rely on immigrant labor. With advances in biometric identity, satellite surveillance, and geofencing, could charter cities become 21st century pop-up labor camps where people enter a country conditionally, borders within borders? Remote compounds like Lindholm Island would no longer be needed. The hard line taken with refugees in Denmark contrasts starkly with the 2018 Memorandum of Agreement to establish a joint data center on forced displacement in Copenhagen's UN city. The United Nations and the World Bank have teamed up to gather evidence on what works in the management of global misery, styling the effort as a global public good. The University of Copenhagen hosts the Center for Advanced Migration Studies. It was established in 2013, and the Danish Refugee Council, Denmark's largest NGO, established in 1956. They hold the world's largest migrant data set, and we know that data is everything. That data is being used to explore alternative migration governance models aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is about managing humans as impact markets. Martin Lemberg Peterson and Aman Hayoti, a 2020 article, Reassembling the Surveillable Refugee Body in an Era of Data Craving, does a solid job of laying out how the process of digitally managing millions of dislocated people have supported the development of global data economies and the emergence of disruptive financial solutions like programmable money. The latter seeks to supplant informal economies and reframe othered people as dynamic risk scores. Though the narrative spun in a 2018 article in MIT Technology Review is that intense blockchain data aggregation should be seen as empowering for those looking to make a new start. Every displaced person is a credit score waiting to be compiled and rated. And this is a quote from that paper. The act of biometric enrollment can be seen as requiring refugees to perform certain acts and roles to obtain the associated entitlements, and that's like the workhouses. Performing docility is key to assembling and reassembling of the web of rights, duties, and consumption opportunities. This can be perceived as a form of quasi-coerced alliance, defined as when one or more actors involved in a transaction are either forced to abide by the rules of a transaction or are otherwise placed in a position in which rejecting a transaction can incur a loss beyond the scope of the rejected proposition. Refugee acts of quasi-citizenship are increasingly determined by intersecting and blurred markets involving actors like the UNHCR, the EU, the World Bank, IrisGuard, Accenture, and the Cairo Amman Bank. These markets are characterized by a pervasive craving for data about displaced populations as risky others. The identities of the displaced and data veiled are thus reassembled according to their aid needs but also according to the donor dictates concerned with risk management and technological and financial market opportunities. Okay. So that's the end of that quote. This quasi-citizenship is evocative of the plot of a science fiction novel. Cory Doctorow's novella Unauthorized Bread and Radicalized comes to mind, and I did that as a read aloud. Unfortunately, Lemberg Peterson, who is with Amnesty International, and Heodi, who is with the IT University of Copenhagen, stopped short of linking manufactured dispossession to the cultivation of social impact investment opportunities. The networks are vast and hiding in plain sight, as illustrated in a map I made a few years back of the Massachusetts Pathways to Economic Advancement project. It links these NGOs, Jobs for the Future, which is reskilling, financialized income sharing agreements through EDLI. That's Jonathan Greenblatt, who is Obama's impact finance guy, who is now at the head of the Anti-Defamation League, and Bloomberg Philanthropies with its Hazira What Works Smart City Government pilots in Israel, where the startup nation is pivoting to be a Tikkun Olam impact nation. Where impact data is the new gold, migrants will deliver as soon as blockchain ID has been fully implemented for supply chain traceability. And I think, if you have a chance to go back to the actual article, although actually now all my little sys maps are dead, so it might be hard to zoom in, but it's actually a really good map. And these were the kind of good immigrants, the good immigrant management that the progressives want. They want them tracked, labeled for the supply chain to fill the micro work needs of the Web3 rollout. We see glimmers of Doctorow's dystopian future in Jeffrey Burns's plans for Painted Rock Smart City and Innovation Park, a privately managed blockchain community in Nevada, and Bill Gates' acquisition of 24,000 acres west of Phoenix for a smart city near Buckeye. The Charter Cities Institute weighed in over the 4th of July weekend of 2020, making the case for privately managed communities being compatible with the United States' legacy of good governance, likening the model to the Mayflower Compact and the First Charter of Virginia. The poor reception of Alphabet Sidewalk Labs' Toronto Quayside project gives me hope that there may still be some clear-thinking people in the world. While most of the criticism leveled at that smart neighborhood revolved around data privacy rights, I continue to hope that one day soon people will start to understand that human capital finance is what is actually driving the demand for big data ubiquitous computing. The Finance Ministry of Denmark is a major donor to UNICEF's Innovation Fund, which operates out of the campus of Singularity University on the former campus of the NASA Research Park, Moffett Field, California. The fund's primary sponsor is Disney. In addition to development of drones, artificial intelligence, and blockchain applications, the fund is working to scale adoption of VR for education in Africa and India, and wearables for measured behavior change. The latter work is carried out with assistance from Frog Design and Cambridge-based embedded sensor firm ARM Holdings. And then I have an image from Twitter that is from May 7th, 2018, where it's from UNICEF Innovation. And they go, "Hello, Denmark. Here's a big AR, hashtag augmented reality. Thank you for supporting our work. We look forward to the coming years to a joint engagement in solving the world's problems using frontier tech. Best UNICEF Innovate." Okay, so they're doing the augmented reality. The learning economy as a digital public good. Deployment of educational technologies is being pushed to gather data for human capital finance deals and machine learning. One of the systems being prototyped is IMSI, an interface where pre-literate children learn to code by hand gesture. UNICEF believes children in Africa are never going to merit human teachers. Besides, the continent's substantial youth population is too important to leave as an unrealized data asset. Much of the software being promoted by UNICEF is open source and pitched as helping create digital public goods. UNICEF is a member of the Digital Public Goods Alliance. This framing is important because the new economic model is driven by data. Tokenized data will be used as the primary governance mechanism of smart contract mixed reality as society acquiesces to cybernetic control. The commons should be understood as an encoded cyber-physical system, not some shared pasture, not a cultural tradition or a civic space. The narrative frame that is being crafted is that the metaverse is quote unquote open, that is being created with quote unquote open source software for quote unquote sovereign digital citizens. So it must be good, right? But in fact, in this Alice in Wonderland world, everything is inverted. When you see open, read restricted. When you see commons, read enclosures. When you see decentralized, read centralized. Once you understand the game is enmeshing everything natural and synthetic sensing webs, the internet intent is easier to assess. And then I have a section about digital public goods. And I think the public part is important because the tokenization, everything has to be framed as for the collective. Investments in these so-called public goods will become quite important in the future. We are already seeing the infrastructure being put in place to track public benefit contributions over time and space in David Dalrymple's presentation for Protocol Labs on Hyperserts below. Dalrymple worked on the creation of virtual organisms with Ed Boyden's synthetic neurobiology group at MIT, and he secured private funding for his research from Peter Thiel and Larry Page. My sense is that what they are doing is attempting to organize information, including biophysical and biogeochemical data, to catalyze some sort of life automata using artificial neural nets, gamified IoT environments, and moralized market logic. And the moralized part is really important because they want our values. The hyperserts presented here would be part of the latter. And perhaps they imagine a biodigital convergence as a form of symbiogenesis. It is difficult to imagine what might be going on in their minds beyond the goal of a seamless human-computer interface. EdTech is the test bed. Okay, so they're using this language of the commons and the common good to get our values and sort of ride co-pilot and parasitically hijack all of our bio and mental energy. So I have some images from Dalrymple's presentation. His bio says that he goes, David Dalrymple, or Davidad, studied computer architecture and programming at MIT, and then biophysics and neuroinformatics at Harvard. And the biophysics are really important. He led an international collaboration to employ new methods to interrogate the smallest nervous system in nature, that of a worm, Canor habitus elegans, funded by personal grants from Google co-founder Larry Page and PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel, which resulted in a publication in Nature Methods. He's also worked in machine learning and software performance engineering at major tech companies. Davidad is one of the co-inventors of Filecoin, but now focuses primarily on longer-term research. He is a frequent visitor to Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute and Machine Intelligence Research Institute. So I think this makes very clear about the biophysics and the data and the commons and this parasitical aspect. They need ways to tag the programs, to track the progress and claim credit for future human well-being. And again, in refugees, you create trauma and then you can take credit for ameliorating the trauma somewhat later. Hyperserts are one way to assess which of the various contributors have responsibility for some communal benefit and to what degree. Coming from a space as an activist parent who opposed the data mining of children through educational technologies, I see that screenshot as representing many programs and interventions pushed on children as digital society tracks their performance and future economic productivity. Sort of a cross between Los Angeles's Daily Pass digital ID, Clever's QR codes, and Soulbound Tokens metadata tags. Children are quantified as public goods. And I think that's really important, and subject to optimization by technological systems. The application of quote unquote evidence-based scientific management of children towards some predetermined outcome on pathways will be justified through the language of equity. The data analysts, program managers, and investors may attempt to convince themselves that this is benevolent, but it isn't. You can see in the image below the treacherous fiction being peddled by UNICEF, Disney, and the finance ministries of Denmark and Finland. And essentially, it's a room of children in VR headsets with their ears all covered, like their entire sensory system is being taken away. It's really, really upsetting. The training will not be just imposed on children. This new economy is so-called a learning economy on blockchain. Refugees are targeted for perpetual data mining through the United Nations High Council on Refugees and allied promoters of competency-based education. Paul LeBlanc At Southern New Hampshire University, home of one of the largest distance learning programs in the US, piloted early blockchain transcripts with MIT's a spin-off learning machine. And they partnered with Google on the development of systems to track and log soft skills among enrolled students. I talk about that, and then I have a link to a post. Southern New Hampshire University's GEM Global Education Movement, which is a mastery-based degree program, was started in 2017 in refugee camps in Lebanon and Africa. The UNHCR also manages a Connected Learning in Crisis program, which is badge-based education for refugees, and that is affiliated with several Catholic and Jesuit institutions. All of this needs to be viewed as a mining operation where children and adults from dislocated communities are literally plugged in to VR headsets to generate data flows that accrue to their biometric ID, establishing their digital reputation with the understanding that one day they might be released back into the real world. And then I have screenshots from Little Sis on competency-based education initiative for refugees, the Connected Learning in Crisis Consortium. And, that includes Jesuit Worldwide Learning, the Australian Catholic University, and as well as, the Southern New Hampshire and the UN High Commissioner on Refugees. The new economic model is shared surveillance, branded as a data commons. The intent of manufactured communities like charter cities is ostensibly to improve economic productivity and well-being while reducing poverty. In the clip below from 2013, George Soros talks about his Institute for New Economic Thinking, which spent the past decade funding experts in the academy and paying them to conceptualize a new game of global economics that would be built on cybernetic social impact finance and closing wealth gaps. The project lead on that was Lord Adair Turner, the former head of the UK Financial Services Authority, who managed the aftermath of the 2008 global banking crisis in England. Paul Romer won the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics when he was teaching at NYU Stern Business School. NYU is a major player in data-driven What Works government through GovLab, based out of the Tandon School of Engineering. It is this government policy infrastructure that will pave the way for, quote unquote, the new economic thinking described by Soros. The prize was for Romer's work in endogenous growth theory that states that growth is best achieved through investment in people that will generate innovative ideas and new technologies. Human capital management is a core element of this proposal. Romer noted that he sought input from James Heckman. Someone asked when I wrote it. This was July. This is why I left Twitter, because no one paid any attention to this when I put this out. And then I just said, I give up. I'm leaving social media, or at least that form, because it's too important. This is all really, really vital stuff. Although I don't fully understand it yet, the concept of quote unquote non-rival goods that Romer proposes feels important. This is a paper he wrote on endogenous technological change in 1990 for the Journal of Political Economy. So feel free to look it over and drop your thoughts in the comments. My sense is that this is a conceptual framework that would be applicable to open source software, and Linux is a major player in digital identity. Then the so-called open metaverse, which is being advanced by NVIDIA and Cesium, and digital public goods being put out largely by the Norwegian government, that is meant to open low and middle countries up to a global data economy, and that this is the economic liberalization for the Web 3.0 era. As I've mentioned often, the growth imperative of capital demands the creation of digital empire before the Ponzi scheme falls apart, and that empire will be made up of ideas and information. Those who aspire to be the next imperial rulers need for us to submit to it and build it for them. Unlike the colonial era in which lands lay on the horizon for the taking by force and trickery, this new world, the mixed reality smart contract world, must first be manifest through the organization of innumerable bits and bytes. Okay, so we actually have to build the empire. Like, it is being built. There's large, big chunks of it already built, but not all of it. The pillow talk being deployed to get us to walk over to the edge of the metaverse pit trap is that we will be creators, peers, members of a collective working in unity to enhance the metaverse commons. And when the harsh reality is that their plan is to use our naivete and need for belonging to turn us into piles of soul-bound tokens, metadata for a poker game run by techno-fascist billionaires and AI supercomputers. You see the way the story is being spun in this excerpt from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation's founder and former Belgian telecom executive Michel Bouwen's 2007 key theses on P2P, peer-to-peer politics, which just happens to be eerily similar to Radical Exchange's plans for plural property, plural money, plural voting, and plural funding. Okay, so this is a quote from this 2007 key theses on peer-to-peer politics. Our current world system is being marked by a profoundly counterproductive logic of social organization. A, it is based on the false concept of abundance in the limited material world. It has created a system based on infinite growth within the confines of finite resources. B, it is based on the false concept of scarcity. In the infinite immaterial world, and I put in parentheses, that is mixed reality or the metaverse. Instead of allowing continuous experimental social innovation, it purposefully erects legal and technical barriers to disallow free cooperation through copyright, patents, etc. Therefore, the number one priority for sustainable civilization is overturning these principles into their opposite. We need to base our physical economy on a recognition of the finitude of natural resources, and I say that's the circular economy, and achieve a sustainable, steady state economy. And I call that cybernetic homeostasis. That's the SODDY work, okay? SODDY. Hierarchy, markets, and even democracy are means to allocate scarce resources through authority, pricing, and negotiation. They are not necessary in the realm of the creation and free exchange of immaterial value, which will be marked by bottom-up forms of peer governance. Markets as a means to manage scarce resources are but one means to achieve such allocation. And I'm saying tokenization is their alternative. And need to be divorced from the idea of capitalism, which is a system of infinite growth. The creation of immaterial value, and I'm calling this the data economy, information economy, knowledge economy, which again needs to become dominant in a post-material world, which recognizes the finiteness of the material world, will be characterized by the further emergence of non-reciprocal peer production. Peer production is a more productive system for producing immaterial value than the for-profit mode. And I would say peer-to-peer production makes social relations visible to the machine. And in cases of the asymmetric competition between for-profit companies and for-benefit institutions and communities, the latter will tend to emerge. Peer production produces more social happiness. And I say in parentheses that is well-being metrics for pay for success and to train the cyber-physical systems how to be more human. So it will produce more social happiness because it is based on the highest form of individual motivation, intrinsic positive motivation, and it is based on the highest form of collective cooperation, synergistic cooperation characterized by 4 wins: the participants times 2, the community, the universal system. Okay, so that's they're talking about the fact that it is finite, but in the metaverse, things can be infinite, and that's where the new economy is going to happen, is in that infinite metaverse space. 2 interesting and related side notes. Number 1, this is from me. The techno-libertarian Holon feature of free market peer-to-peer exchange is embodied in Daniel Suarez's 2 books, Demon, D-A-E-M-O-N, and Freedom, reviewed here by the Peer-to-Peer Foundation in 2010. And I would actually recommend you read those books and look at the review because it's very helpful about the Holon structure. Bouwen's, and number 2, Bouwen's operates out of Chiang Mai, which is a city in northern Thailand, the mountainous former center of the Lana Thai kingdom and home to many ornate temples, which, based on conversations with my dear friend Deepti in Goa, India, brings to mind a quote from Lincoln Cannon, who is a member of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. Maybe you just don't see anything in this picture that you recognize as technology. So I think that some of these spiritual technologies already exist. And yeah, so it's maybe he's in a place where they have the spiritual technology, which are these temples, and it's interesting that that's where he would choose to locate. Okay, so I haven't had a chance to do more than skim it, but Nicholas Negroponte's 1995 book, Being Digital, appears to be a very accessible entry point into the physics of the information economy. The planned future revolves around a knowledge economy, which is swiftly morphing into the data economy, which in turn rests on social impact finance, perpetual reskilling to compete against AI, and health surveillance that legitimizes coerced bodily intake of the torrent of synthetic biological knowledge turned out by thousands of biotech ventures. Romer's theory of growth promotes investment in education, healthcare, and telecommunications, which on the surface sound good. But what they don't say is that measuring returns on these investments will require the invasive use of Internet of Bodies wearables and biometric identity linked to our education and health records. While teaching at Stanford, Romer developed an online homework assignment platform called Aplia that was later bought out by Cengage in 2007. And so he practices what he preaches. EdTech is an enormous area for investment, as evidenced by BlackRock's recent launch of a new entertainment/education themed ETF, exchange traded fund called Play, PLAY, that tracks stocks in EdTech, gaming, and digital device sectors. This new global economy of quote unquote ideas seems to be apps and games, while the future of quote unquote work is navigating games under digital surveillance. I'm sure it sounded better to Romer back in the early 1980s when he was writing his dissertation. I imagine his outlook is closely aligned with the tenets of the United Nations and the World Bank's affiliated Learning Economy Foundation. Learning Economy joined the UN's ID 2020 program 6 months after Romer stepped down from his position as chief economist at the World Bank. And then I have an image about from Learning Economy Foundation, is education a new currency? Charter cities built from the ground up with smart infrastructure will become glorified Skinner boxes. Sidortsov also thought that it would be useful for UN peacekeeping forces to get involved in setting up these new settlements, because if international energy firms can own large tracts of land in developing nations, why not the United Nations? It's such an honorable project. Who could possibly refuse? And then this is a quote. As I noted above, Romer is currently trying to persuade leaders of developing countries to invest into charter cities. However, his ideas should be appealing to a much broader audience. Charter cities present a rare triple dividend solution of environmental, sociopolitical, and economic problems. This makes charter cities a primary goal for international aid funds of various flags and colors. For example, refugee camps provide a temporary yet critical solution of humanitarian crisis. However, they depend on international aid and do not provide a permanent solution, whereas charter cities do. On the climate change front, a charter city can be a perfect candidate for a carbon offset project and can be funded through a newly established Green Climate Fund. Finally, because a charter city creates a mechanism for sustainable economic growth, it should be a primary target for economic aid. Overall, investments in charter cities are a much more effective and productive way to distribute $120 billion that developed countries spend on international aid. And so just think about that. Like, think about that shift. That's really big, right? I mean, they're like, okay, we're not just giving this money away, right? We want something for it. We want your data. We want your compliance. And if we're generating a profit, just as I say, if you're making a profit on poverty, you're never going to end it, right? Like, if you're making a profit on traumatized, dislocated people, you're only going to grow that market. Like, just imagine what these charter cities look like and how many that they're going to grow just to justify the flow of these capital and a place to test their ideas, right? To grow their knowledge economy, their impact economy. It's quite dark. I mean, if you think about it, Anyway, so this goes on. This is continuing. This is part of the quote still. Charter cities present a unique opportunity as a test bed for new economy ideas reflected in the works of several authors. Free of public pressure, the governing body can internalize environmental costs by shifting the tax burden from payrolls to carbon and other pollutants. As the German energy tax experience shows, such a shift spurs green economic growth and innovation. Because a charter city or village will be planned completely or almost completely from scratch, smart urban design and permaculture principles will be utilized. Finally, sustainable charter cities can serve as hubs for new business organization forms, such as for-benefit corporations. And, I just did that site visit out to B Lab that is like, authorizing all of these benefit corporations. And it's all about the data, right? Like that you're showing measurable impact. So this is just this logic, right? Like if we can get out of like the particulars of the polarizing influences and the narrative, like the logic of this thing that they're setting up is dislocate people, create purpose-built state of exception communities within national borders run by non-accountable entities to churn ESG finance capital. And then all of it is about behavioral compliance. So like, how are you going to be able to say no, right? If you're a refugee and, you're trapped, it is a prison. Like it might be a slightly bigger prison, or it might be a slightly better prison than the existing refugee camps, but it's a smart prison. And so I think that they're using this to refine all of these technological systems as they have been. Like I said, that my first entry point into this was seeing that they were doing the retinal scans to pay for groceries. And these were all being done by like the Nordic states, right? Like the nice Scandinavians, the ones with the social safety net and all these things. Like they were the ones funding the UNICEF innovation, funding these really highly technological control mechanisms. So this is just the ending of this piece. Sidortsov then goes on to say that while some worry cities run on public-private partnerships might risk subsuming the public sector entirely, we shouldn't be concerned because there are models like Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain that generate strong economic growth. More on the Mondragon Corporation in the next part. So then I'm going to be moving on to Mondragon. And that was a long post. I guess it's been an hour and a half that I've been reading through it, but it's one of 4. It's, I'm trying to create some other narratives. And again, like throughout the Ukraine situation, but I mean, think about how many people have been dispossessed all around the world. But Ukraine, I think in particular, is going to be a test bed because of the technological and remote work aspects. So now I'm going to just, like the Scandinavia, the Nordic stuff. So once I figure out how to do this double, whatever, screen share with my maps, it is important to note that, like central to this is, the Nordic countries. Like they're in the center of this digital democracy stuff with this Digidem lab, and they're connected to Nesta as well. And they're just a couple years back, they had this whole report that came out where they were piloting it. Actually, that isn't directly connected to the Nordic countries. That's Belgium, Portugal, UK, US, Italy, and Hong Kong. But it's called Combining Crowds and Machines, Experiments in Collective Intelligence. And so that's like the combining the crowds and machines is what I'm going to talk about next if people want to hang out and listen to a little more from the Swarm Intelligence book as I finish this chapter. I live next to a school next door. It's an elementary school. They have recess. It's very loud. There's a lot of squealing and, like whatever, but I can appreciate it because like, to me, that actually is sort of the wonder of humanity, is there this random chaotic energy, unchanneled energy. And then I think about the way in which they would like to channel this into some sort of swarm intelligence system, like to run their cryptography or to, train their hive mind or to use this as their human ant computer. So anyway, I'm just going to move on with this. I started a day or so ago. This is from the Swarm Intelligence book, James Kennedy and Russell Everhart. I think it's about 20 years old at this point. I was in chapter 3 called On Our Non-Existence as Entities, the Social Organism, which is very much related to, the world sensorium that I'm always talking about. And I started off talking the last time about stigmergy and sensory trails and using ants, which are very simple, as computers, and also the slime mold. But there were a couple of sections that I hadn't quite finished this chapter. It was about flocking, herding, and schooling. And so I think I'll just finish this, finish off this part for people who are interested in listening to the rest of this chapter. Okay, so it's called this section. So again, like here's the book. Here's the the part that I'm doing now. And it's called Staying Together But Not Colliding, Flocks, Herds, and Schools. Okay, so where ants move more or less randomly around their physical world, some other social animals move about in more orderly ways. Many species of fish, for example, swim in schools that seem to take on an emergent life of their own. A fish school appears to move as one with hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of fish changing direction, darting at what appears to be the same exact instant. In 1954, a Smithsonian zoologist named Brader attempted to meet the interesting challenge, contriving a mathematical model to describe the behavior of schooling fishes. Analyzing the empirical biological data, Brader argued that the cohesiveness of a school is a function of the number of fish in the school and the distance between fish, and that something he called the quote-unquote potential of each individual, which varies with size, among other things. Brader showed that the attraction of a school for a solitary fish, measured by placing a fish on one side of a divided aquarium with various numbers of fish in the other side where they could be seen, and seeing how much the isolated fish swam on the social half of its side, was described by formula C equals K and 1, where K and T are constants and N is the number of fish in the other tank. In one of his examples, K equals 0.355 and T equals 0.818. The effect of having an exponent T less than 1 is that the attractiveness of the group increases, but the increase becomes less as the group increases in size. A larger school is more attractive than a smaller school, but the impact of adding one more individual to the group is more pronounced in a smaller group. The difference between 4 and 5 members may be the same numerically as the difference between 99 and 100, but the effect of adding one to a group of 4 is much greater in terms of social attractiveness. Brader's conclusion is interesting, indeed, in light of the more recent theory of human social behavior. Bibb Laton's social impact theory, conceived of in the 1970s and still evolving, resulted from dozens of laboratory and field experiments in human subjects. Laton in 1981. Laton finds that the impact of a group on an individual is a function of the strength, immediacy, and number of sources of influence. That is, the other people. Strength is a kind of social influence variable, similar to status or persuasiveness or potential. Immediacy is the inverse of distance, such as immediacy increases as distance decreases, and number is simply the number of people influencing the target individual. Laton has found, for instance, that the size of the tip left by a group of people in a restaurant is a function of the number of people sitting at the table. The more people in a party, the larger the total amount, but the smaller the percentage each pays of the bill. The nervousness of participants in a college talent show was shown to be a function of the number of people in the audience. In these cases and many more, the effect of the number of sources of influence was found to fit a formula. I equals KNT, where I is impact, N is the number of sources of influence, and K and T are constant, and T is less than 1. Thus, the impact of a group increases monotonically with the size of the group, but the increase slows with group size just as it does in fish schools. It may not be the most flattering self-image for us to view ourselves as flocking, schooling conformists, but the literature of social psychology since the 1930s consistently shows us to be, in spite of ourselves, herding creatures. Whenever people interact, they become more similar as they influence and imitate one another, teach and learn from one another, lead and follow one another. Norms and cultures, and we would say minds, are the result. It is not the usual case that humans move in synchronously choreographed swoops and dashes across the landscape as fish and birds do. Human physical behaviors are not flock-like or school-like, but the trajectories of human thoughts through high-dimensional cognitive space just might be. And I think this is really important. Thinking about, the trajectory of thought, and that they know this, right? They've known this for 50 years or more, since the 30s, really. But I mean, this guy's research is in the 80s. So they've known it solidly for 40 years, how to manipulate people in the metaverse, in their thoughts. A very influential simulation of bird flocking was published by Craig Reynolds in 1987. Reynolds assumed that flocking birds were driven by three local forces: collision avoidance, velocity matching, and flock centering. That is Boyd's, Reynolds' name for his simulated birds. They do one, they pull away before they crash into one another. Two, they try to go around the same speed as their neighbors in the flock. Three, they try to move towards the center of the flock as they perceive it. Implementing just these three rules, Reynolds' program shows very realistic flocking behavior, with coherent clusters of Boyds whirling through the three-dimensional simulated space, splitting to flock around obstacles and rejoining again. Reynolds has gone on to provide animation of herds and flocks for movies, and his simple, non-centralized algorithm lies behind many animated cinematic sequences. The biologist B.L. Partridge showed that fish seem to regulate their schooling behavior using visual information and information from the fish's lateral line. Vision guides the approach or flock centering tendency. Blinded pollocks swim farther from their neighbors than do fish with vision. The lateral line, on the other hand, enables collision avoiding repulsive force. Fish with their lateral lines, how did we get from birds to fish? Okay, all right. Fish with their lateral lines removed swam closer to the neighbors than did normal fish. Fish that were either blinded or had their lateral lines removed still schooled, but fish with both sensory systems disabled did not maintain their position in the school at all. Thus, there is empirical support for a biological infrastructure corresponding to Reynolds' simple rules, at least in fish. In a classic 1971 paper called Geometry for the Selfish Herd, W.D. Hamilton proposed one explanation for the why of herding, schooling, and flocking behavior, a functional explanation showing what it accomplishes. These social congregations are seen more often in prey than predators. Hamilton noted that an animal at the edge of the herd is more likely to be picked off by a predator. Thus, the selfish behavior of any member of the population would be to try to move as close to the center of the herd as possible. The population level effect of this response, along with some simple rules to minimize collisions and other conflicts, is the organized behavior seen in nature. And I think that's interesting to think about, right? That you don't want to be on the edge, right? You want to be solidly in the middle. So if you imagine that, like in terms of social media relations, I think that's interesting. Nobody wants to be on the edge. Everybody wants to demonstrate their conformity, like by centering, right? And there's not a lot of reward in being out on the edge. And that's why we don't get new ideas, right? That's why new ideas don't break through once they're established. In his paper, Flocks, Herds, and Schools, a Distributed Behavioral Model, Craig Reynolds, 1987, had compared his model to a particle system. Particle systems are a kind of computer graphics method that comprise large numbers of individual agents or objects, each having its own behavior. Reynolds noted that bold behavior is more complicated than the typical particle system and less complicated than the behaviors of real birds. Okay. At about the same time, the early 1980s, in less widely cited but more empirical research, University of Rhode Island biologist Frank Hepner observed bird flocks using a pair of moving cameras placed at 90-degree angles, filming at 3 frames per second. Watching the movies one frame at a time, Hepner could distinguish some features of flocking that had previously not been understood. For instance, he concluded that there was not, in fact, a leader to the flock. Any bird could lead a maneuver at any time. The flock maintained a kind of dynamic equilibrium without any central control. Hepner had also been experimenting with a computer program implementing Conway's Game of Life and noted that the spontaneous behaviors of gliders in the program bore a strong resemblance to the spontaneous order that arose in bird flocks he was studying. He assembled a small team including himself, applied mathematician Ulf Grenander, and an undergraduate programmer named Daniel Potter, and they began investigating the possibility that complex bird flock maneuvers could emerge from programs of very simple rules. The result was a graphical display of artificial bird flocks whose coordinated movements were startlingly similar to the real thing. The rules that Hepner and his colleagues implemented were somewhat similar to Reynolds, but with some differences. Hepner, too, implemented an attractive force rule, which attracted birds towards one another unless they were too close, in which case they were repelled. Unlike Reynolds' Boyd's, Hepners were attracted to a roost. The closer they got to it, the stronger the attraction would become. Hepner's birds had a tendency to maintain a target velocity, and finally, birds were occasionally knocked off course by a random force, similar to a gust of wind. Again, the result was a very believable, simple, decentralized simulation of bird flock choreography. Some of our own earliest experiments were derived from approximations of Reynolds Hepner's bird flocks. In fact, Hepner's roost idea provided an inspiration that led us deep into the study of swarm intelligence. Kennedy and Eberhardt, 1995. In our very first experiments, populations of quote unquote birds flew in orderly flocking patterns. If birds could be programmed to flock toward a roost, then how about having them look for something like birdseed? It seems impossible that birds flying hundreds of feet in the air could see something as tiny as seed on the ground, but they are able to find it. A flock of birds might fly over a neighborhood watching for signs of edibles, and importantly, those signs might come through observing other birds eating or circling on a target, or in seeing another member of the flock turning back and descending towards something it might have seen. These are social cues of a different order from seeing the food substance itself, seeing somebody seeing something. The flock does not know where the seed is, but it responds to social signals by turning back, flying past the target, circling around, spiraling in cautiously until the birds are sure that they have found food in a safe place. In one of our first publications on the topic of particle swarm algorithm, we called that optimum the cornfield vector, suggesting that the population members have a motivation to find the hidden point. It is like finding something in a landscape where the searcher gets clues from other searchers. Well, that's interesting because I sort of feel like a little bit that's what I'm trying to do, guys. Like I'm trying to be a searcher, right? And I'm not saying I always have the right social cues, but I feel like, yeah, like when we're doing some things, you know, it's interesting to think about like flocks and moving and behaviors. And then when you find there are certain individuals within the flock that find a point of interest, and then how that um, scouting behavior, how that identification behavior is either supported or not supported. That's actually kind of interesting to me to think about that. Okay, so most recently, physicists Toner and Tu published a mathematical analysis in a paper with the familiar sounding title, Flocks, Herds, and Schools, a quantitative theory of flocking. Their model analyzes the collective movements of large numbers of self-propelled agents or organisms. They note that flock simulations have several features in common. First, a flock is made up of a large number of individuals attempting to move in the same direction as their neighbors. Second, individuals, these authors also called them boids, responded only to their nearer neighbors. Third, stochastic noise, randomness, is introduced into the individual's movements so that flocking is never perfect. And finally, rotational symmetry is maintained. That is, the flock is equally likely to move in any direction. Toner and Tu assert that one of the most interesting things about flocks is that they never attain equilibrium. The behavior of a flock resembles a type 4 cellular automaton, continuing in characteristic but unpredictable patterns that extend for long periods of time. Our particle swarms described later in the book seem to share this attribute with flocks. In flocking simulations, the important thing to simulate is coordinated movement of the organisms, whether flocks, herds, or schools. Some motives for studying such topics include the desire to understand biological aspects of social behavior and the wish to create interesting and lucrative graphical effects. There is another, more pragmatic reason to learn about coordinating movements with simple, decentralized rules, and that is to design and develop robot societies. Okay, so we've got robot societies. So, I think that this is, I like Avril Haines becoming sort of head of intelligence and her connections to the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. We are being herded into the metaverse. We are being herded into the digital empire. And we are being studied. We are being analyzed. We are being tagged and tracked. Like all of these, automaton birds were actually, being monitored and tweaked. And I think we have to understand all of the sides are being identified and grouped, right? And, I would just invite you to look back and think about like what has happened over the past couple of years and how things have evolved and how groups have solidified, and leaders have solidified and influencers have solidified, and some have risen up and some have fallen, and different lines have merged together. There have been alliances built on both sides of this polarized situation. And to imagine the stories, because all of this is narrative structure, the story of getting us through various kinds of storytelling to all end up at the same point. And I know that there are people who have like given me a lot of flack, like for a long time, about the blockchain stuff. Oh, it's just a tool, it's how you use it or whatever. But it is the tagging, tracking, optimizing, interoperability, predictive risk profiling, mind file nudging thing. Like, no, that's what it was built for. It was built to get us into the metaverse. It was built to be the progressive tokenomics. It was built to be the libertarian freedom coin. It was built to be all of those things, your health record, your government alliance, your education transcript. Like, it was meant to be all of those things because we're all being herded based on the data. So yeah, anyway, that's it's interesting for me to sort of read this and apply, right? Okay, so they want to make robot societies. Okay, so this is the next section, robot societies. The stereotypical movie robot is an android with voice recognition interface and a sardonic sense of humor. In fact, the most common type of robot is quite a bit less exotic than that. Often built out of Legos with a couple of motors and some big cables that need to be held up by a graduate student who follows the robot around the room. It will be worthwhile for us to sidetrack for a moment. Now, again, this is 20 years ago. To sidetrack for a moment and talk about robot intelligence, since some of the most important work on swarms and swarm intelligence is being conducted in that field. In the early days of electronic computing, robots were a perfect laboratory for the implementation of artificial intelligence, and the classic robots were based on the paradigm that has come to be known as GOFAI, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, which is practically synonymous with the symbol processing paradigm. Robot intelligence was presumed to operate, in fact, human intelligence was presumed to operate through the manipulation of symbols. Presumably, the same rules of logic should operate on any set of symbols, no matter what the subject domain. Generally, a robot or human mind was presumed to contain a central executive processor. This was presumed to include a kind of interference engine that operates on data that had been prepared by a perceptual system. And the executive's output was sent to effectors or motor devices, which were able to act upon the world. Given the assumptions of cognitive science and the profound vanity of humans generally, it is not surprising that scientists would assign the will or central executive to a central role in the artificial mind and implement a system of information processing that followed directly from a classical academic philosophy of the universities, and before that, from the pronouncements of the church. The early researchers had no way of knowing that the scientific psychology would fail to support their intuitions about human nature and the mind. Remember that before the cognitive revolution of the 1960s and 70s, almost all scientific psychology was behavioristic, dismissing everything mental as unworthy of scientific study. Thus, there was not a well-developed understanding of things cognitive. In robots, it turned out that the symbol processing approach just didn't work out very well. As the robot's world became more complicated, the robot's mind became more complicated. It had more symbols to retain. Worse, maintenance of complicated chains of logic meant that it had to figure out that when one fact changes, other facts have to change too. And it is not trivial to deduce which ones. For instance, if you are told that someone has just turned out the lights, you know immediately that they can't see where they're going. A symbol processor has to figure it out. GOFAI robots, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence robots, might stand in one spot for 10 minutes, contemplating their next step, trying to figure out whether they would bump into something. In a highly readable paper called Elephants Don't Play Chess, MIT researcher Rodney Brooks in 1991 proposed an alternative to the GOFAI, a tradition with deep roots at MIT, by the way. And Brooks argued that symbols must be grounded in a physical reality if they are to have any meaning. Brooks's view solved some computational problems that had made real-world robotics intractable, and the successful results seen in Brooks's lab lent support to his conjecture. Brooks's robots' minds are organized according to a principle called the subsumption architecture. A subsumption architecture is built from the bottom up. Simple robot behaviors are developed, and then these are fitted loosely together. They remain independent of one another. Each module is doing its specific part without consulting the other. For instance, Brooks's soda can finding robot, Herbert, has a collision avoidance module that sends a signal to turn it when it comes too close to something it might bump into, and a can pickup module to pick up the cans when it finds them. Herbert can pick up cans whether it is or is not avoiding anything, and it can avoid things without picking up cans, or do neither, or do both. The modules are independent. Further, both modules are grounded in the world. That is, avoidance happens when there is something in the world to avoid, and picking up happens when a can is detected in the world. There is nothing like a central executive control. The quotable Brooks has said, "The world is its own best model. It is always exactly up to date. It always contains every detail there is to be known." Rather than maintaining a symbolic representation of the world, Brooks's robots simply respond to the world, and it presents itself to the sensors. The effect of this is that their computation can be reduced to a tiny fraction, perhaps 1 or 2%, of what was required by previous robots. Programs can be smaller, storage and memory requirements are reduced, and as a result, smaller and smarter robots can be built more cheaply. Brooks's robots are able to navigate messy scenes. For example, Herbert roams around cluttered laboratory offices looking for empty cans, which it picks up and throws away. No set of rules could prepare a symbol processor for all the kinds of complexities that might exist there. For instance, tipped over chairs, wadded up papers, tipped over graduate students for that matter. The bottom-up subsumption architecture, though, is able to adapt to whatever conditions it finds. Tom and Jerry were two identical robots that were programmed to interact with each other. They were given an urge to wander around, that is, to perform random actions, a repulsive force that kept them from bumping into things, and were programmed as well with an attractive force to make them move towards distant things. They also had a motion detector sense that allowed them to detect moving objects, most likely one another, and then follow them, a possible genesis of robot sociality. Construction of subsumption architectures is bottom up. It is incremental. Small parts are constructed and then fitted together in a way that Brooks likens to evolutionary change. Communication among various modules is minimal, with tight coupling between modules and the world. The hallmark of such an intelligence is that it is decentralized, a theme that should be getting familiar by now. In the subsumption architecture, behaviors are separate, each one defined to accomplish one small distinct goal. Yet someone watching the robot feels that there is an intentional unity about the way it moves. Wheels are programmed to stop when the robot approaches a possible soda can. Arms are programmed to reach up when the wheels stop turning. A hand is programmed to grasp when the light beam between the fingers and thumb is broken. An observer sees the robot go to the table, reach out, and pick up a can. Oddly, goal-directed behavior emerges, or so it seems, from a sequence of fixed action patterns, linking perceptions to actions. Pushes look like pulls through the prism of our biological brains. Wow. That's interesting. Pushes look like pulls. So think about the modules and the communication, right? So all of these things are small units, right? And they're interconnected and they're connected to the real world. Now think about what we know about smart contracts, right? Think about what we know about program money and the way in which you can layer them, right? It is adding a logic layer to the world, which again, I'm not saying that the world doesn't have logic in and of itself, but it's a mechanical logic. There's like an added mechanical logic layer to the world that is coming with Web3. And if you can imagine, there are all of these if-then statements. Like, we are literally going to be programmed by our environment and the tokenization of what's in our digital identity wallets. And we'll be bumping around like these robots with rules, right? There will be rules imposed, some of which we may know and some of which we may have to learn, and they may be modular. And there might be imagine smart contracts in the environment that are consecutive. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it like this before, but if like we are sort of like the robots they are programming through the smart contract layer with these simple rules that independently might not look like much, but if you aggregate them, that's a really complex behavior. And where he's saying here that pushes, meaning all of these modules, like here's what happens like when you get close to something, when you see, let's see, what do they say? It's the wheels stop when the robot sees a possible can. So there's the coding of stop the wheels, reach up the arms, move the hand in that direction, grab it if it matches the visual sensor. Like all of those are layered contracts. And oh gosh, people, can we block this person? Oh, I'm sorry. I need to take a second and try to like block this person. Oh. Report. Just a second. Sorry about this. Report that. Okay. Hopefully it's not going to be going on for much longer. Remove. Let me just remove these things. Remove. Sorry. Okay. All right. So I've got that. Sorry. Yeah. All right. Go away. We don't need your sex robots here. Oh gosh, I need to like actually put this person out. Anyway, so yeah, they found us, right? Oh, we're 2 hours in, so the sex robots have found us. Yeah, so I'm sure they have a lot of programmed behaviors too. But when they talk about all of those things sequentially, looking like a pull, only it's a push. And so that's the nudge, right? That's all of the nudge. So that's quite fascinating. I mean, do you guys like have thoughts about that? Like, does that make sense to you that these coded smart contract layers are really like programming us like robots through all of these simple rules, right? Many simple rules just for the common good, everybody, just for the common good. Okay, I think I'm getting close. How many more pages do I have? Oh gosh. Artificial Robot Societies goes on for a ways. Okay, it's like 5 pages. All right, I'm going to keep going. Hopefully they don't find us again. All right, so all right. So the pushes look like pulls. Okay. Marvin Minsky, another MIT veteran, calls such cognitive modularity a society of mind. Unfortunately, where Brooks makes it clear that he's talking about robots, man-made minds and simple ones at that. Minsky takes the model of AI modularity and tries to use it to explain the workings of the human mind. Minsky's coffee table book, Society of Mind, contains 270 essays, each one packaged as a pearl of wisdom or aphoristic reading on a psychological or cognitive topic. The theme of the book is that the mind is composed of a society of specialized functions or agents that operate more or less independently of one another. Unfortunately, the subsumption approach that is so successful with robots has no basis in psychology, though there is evidence of modularity in the organization of the brain. The metaphor of a society of cognitive agents is exactly the kind of reified fiction that scientific psychology rejects. There is no homunculus inside the head, never mind teams of homonuclei. Near the end of his book, Minsky summarizes with the statement, "Minds are simply what brains do." The statement is concise and superficially plausible. It seems to do away with the mind-body problem in one slicing phrase and reduces much of Western philosophy to dry chattering. But the statement is obviously incorrect. There is doubtless a relation between brains and minds, but there are very many brains that don't do minds at all. For instance, bird brains and bug brains and sleeping brains and fetus brains and damaged brains and dead brains definitely don't do minds. There are also lots of things that brains do that are not mind: having seizures, controlling digestion, growing, metabolizing oxygen, hemorrhaging. Further, there don't seem to be any reason that minds require brains. We can imagine aliens having minds, and there is a strong enough case for computers having minds, at least potentially, that Minsky's statement just can't be true in an absolute sense. Even worse, the statement, and by the cognitivistic philosophy that supports it, assumes that a brain by itself will even grant that it is a healthy human brain would develop into a mind, that it would become conscious and learn to think, which we take to be minimum requirements for something to be called a mind. And this ignores all social science research for the past 100 years. In order for a brain to become mental, it needs to have interaction with other minds. A fetal brain grown to adulthood in a vat containing nutritious fluids would never acquire the qualities of mind. If it were transplanted into a Frankensteinian body, it would be unable to reason, remember, categorize, communicate, or do any of the other things that a minimal mind should be able to do. Feral humans, that is, humans who have grown up in the wild, have never been known to show signs of having anything like a mind. It is not sufficient to have perceptual stimuli. Social ones are necessary. The relation between mind and society is unquestionable, but it is ignored by the Minsky's oversimplifying where society is moved into the cavern of the skull. And I think this is really interesting, the social aspect of it, right? Because this is why if this predator energy wants to be what it imagines to be alive, like socially, that it needs all of this social material. It needs it needs our electronic governance. It needs our electronic, engagement. It needs our social relations. It needs to see our values. It needs our art. It needs our culture. It needs all of those things. We would have thought that the issue was more or less settled in the research debate between Ernest Hillard, a cognitivist, and Nicholas Spanos, a social psychologist, in a fascinating series of investigations into the nature of hypnotic responding, multiple personalities, and other forms of psychopathology. Hildgaard's neo-dissociation theory of 1979 postulated autonomous cognitive processes inside of the mind, which under certain circumstances separated and acted independently from the self. For instance, in hypnosis, cognitive subsystems could come under the control of a hypnotist. Hildgaard's mechanistic model resembles Minsky's society of mind, with agentic substructures expressing autonomous volition beyond the reach of the individual self. Spanos, 1982 and 86, on the other hand, argued that individuals were simply acting in ways they believed were appropriate for situations labeled hypnosis, multiple personality, and so on. Anyone can act like they have multiple personalities, but only a few people convince themselves. According to Spanos' sociocognitive theory, hypnosis and certain forms of pathological responding were manifestations of normal behavior. No internal systems or agents were invoked to explain behaviors. Hypnosis, in this view, is something the person does, not something that happens to him. Where Hildgaard's experiments would seem to show that a hypnotist could communicate with different autonomous subsystems of the hypnotized person. For instance, a hidden observer within the subject sealed off from the rest of the cognitive system. Spanos would replicate the experiments under slightly different conditions to show that the hypnotized individuals were just doing what they thought they should be doing. The neo-dissociationist internal special processes were shown to be fictitious, theoretical constructions with no basis in reality. Again and again, Hildgaard and his colleagues attempted to prove the existence of cognitive substructures, and repeatedly Spanos' case for strategic role enactment prevailed. Nothing is gained in thinking of the mind as a society of interacting agents. There are some differences between multi-agent systems, such as the subsumption architecture, and swarms, such as are being described here. In swarm intelligence, the global behavior of the swarm is an emergent effect of the local interactions of swarm members. In a system of multiple autonomous agents, however, the system's behavior is more nearly a sum of the agent's contributions. The effect may strike a human observer as being surprisingly well choreographed, as if the robot were pursuing a goal, but that is only a matter of attribution by the observer. In fact, behaviors are exactly what they have been programmed to be, and the cause of the surprise is anthropocentrism, not emergence. Further, individuals in a swarm are usually relatively homogeneous, while society of the mind or subsumption modules are assigned to specialized tasks. One ant is the same as the next. One bee does pretty much the same thing as the next bee. Grasping is very different from looking, which is different from rolling. Rodney Brooks has expressed the opinion that robots will continue to get smaller and smaller. Indeed, the simplicity of the subsumption architecture enables such miniaturization. For instance, he says, imagine a colony of gnat robots living in your television that come out when the set is off and dust the screen. Indeed, the stage is set for such developments. It appears likely, though, that the miniature robots of the future will probably not be seen as autonomous agents, each one fully empowered to accomplish whole tasks. The microbots of the future will be swarms. And so that's interesting. Well, if we think about NEMS and MEMS, nano electromechanical devices, and micro electromechanical devices. Yeah, like we're not used to thinking of robots as tiny things. On an even smaller scale, okay, here we go, are the nanotechnology robot swarms envisioned and described by Kurzweil in 1999. Large assemblies of the constituent nanomachines will be able to create any desired environment. One example of nanorobot swarms described by Hall in 1994, in which each nanorobot, called a foglet, is a cell-sized device with 12 arms pointing every which way with a gripper. And a large assemblages of these devices can not only cooperate to form large structures, but also form distributed intelligence. But let us come back to the present for the moment. Toshio Fukeda's laboratory in Nagoya, Japan, is a day and night business bustle of graduate students, postdocs, assistant professors, and engineers, planning, designing, and building robots of many types. For Honda Corporation, Fukada has built a life-size android robot with 2 legs, 2 arms, and a trunk and a head, balancing and walking with a human-like gait. If you shove this robot backwards, it will flail its arms and catch its balance just like a person would. It's a lucky thing, too, since it weighs nearly 600 pounds. Fukada's lab also produces robot gibbons, 2 mechanical arms and the trunk of a body. A gibbon is able to train itself to swing from limb to limb in an artificial jungle, with both overhanded and underhanded brachiation movements. When a gibbon's hand is knocked from its branch, the robot swings incrementally higher and higher until it can reach the branch again, just as a real gibbon or monkey would do. In lectures, Fukada likes to show a video of a gibbon in the jungle setting and say, "That is not a robot, that is a real monkey." In the next scene, a robotic gibbon is depicted with an uncanny resemblance to the live one, and Fukada says, "That is a robot." And Fukada's lab is developing robot swarms, where Brooks's subsumption methodology took the cognitive executive control out of the picture, decentralizing the individual robot behavior. Fukada's robots replace the individual's control with reflex and reactive influence of one robot by another. These decentralized systems have the advantages of each individual can be much simpler than the design of the fully autonomous robot, and the processor required and the code that runs on it can be small and inexpensive. Further, individuals are exchangeable. We think back to 1994 when the NASA robot named Dante 2 ambled several hundred feet down into an inferno of Mount Spur, a violent Alaskan volcano, to measure gases that were being released from the bowels of the earth. The 1,700-pound Dante 2 toppled into those self-same bowels. It would now just be an expensive piece of molten litter, if helicopters bearing Earthlings had not saved it, for instance. If the accident had happened on another planet, which is what Dante was being developed for, if instead a swarm of cheap robots had been sent into the crater, perhaps a few would have been lost, but the mission could have continued and succeeded. Dante 2 was named after Dante 1, whose tether snapped only 21 feet into Mount Erebus in 1993, another potentially expensive loss. And so I would say, like, think about these as sensors, right? Think about the robots doing tasks, right? Distributed systems doing these tasks. Like and they're imperative to get the cost down through distribution, right? And so part of what I was talking about the other day is this idea that they want us to be sensors. They want the humans with embedded sensor technology or wearable technology or holdable technology to be its perception in the environment, in the world. And if you follow this logic that their goal is to have something that is relatively disposable and non-costly, then all of the stuff I was just saying about refugees would probably fall into that category, because as sick as it sounds, like they, in the calculus of this structure of domination, they would probably perceive as individual refugee population community members as relatively disposable, right? Like if you have these distributed robots, you don't want the, fancy theoretical physicist with 5 degrees, from the fanciest universities doing the thing, right, that might cause it to not be available for the project. You'd rather use a distributed system of disposable items, which I think is sort of how they might view these disadvantaged, displaced populations. Robots are, and it's terrible, by the way, I'm not agreeing with that. I'm just saying that there is a twisted logic to it. If you apply that logic and imagine, like, I don't know that these people are necessarily thinking about it like that, but there is this embedded twisted logic. Robots are different from pure software agents in one obvious but important respect. They must follow the laws of physics in the three-dimensional world. They have to deal with collisions somehow. The locomotion of cellular robots in physical place in most implementations is programmed as some variable on Reynolds's three-rule Boyd's algorithm, where individuals are attracted to the group, repulsed by two near neighbors, and attempt to match velocities with neighbors. For research purposes, it is certainly less expensive to write a program than to make real robots, especially when there are a great number of them. Some of the Fukuda studies in self-organizing societies of robots are in fact implemented with software robots by programming appropriate physics into their simulations. Researchers can get the bugs out of their robots before the costs get too high. And I think these metaverse spaces are probably very similar. That's why there's a cost imperative for Society 5.0 and cyborg avatar capitalism, because it's cheaper to push people into the metaverse. It's more controllable and it's cheaper. At Georgia Tech, Jennifer Hodgkins and her colleagues experiment with software robots programmed with full simulated real-world physics. Their standard simulated robot, for some reason, is a one-legged hopping robot, something like a bowling ball / pogo stick combo. The simulated robot moves by leaning and hopping. The steeper it leans, the farther it hops. Hodgkin's algorithm for group behavior has two parts: a perception model and a placement algorithm. The perception model lets the robot scan its simulated environment. For instance, if there are, as is one of her reports, 105 robots and each one needs to avoid colliding with its neighbor, then they must be able to tell who is nearby. In a simulation, this means the program has to loop through each of the robots one at a time, and for each one to calculate the distance to all the others in order to determine which ones are nearest. A total of 105 squared, or 11,025 calculations at each time step. This has been called the problem of n squared complexity, and it's computationally very expensive. The movements of the robots will be slowed as the computer is busy calculating neighborhoods. In fact, this is a good reason for Brooks to say the world is its own best model. While a computer has to work very hard to tell individual agents what is around them, an embodied agent only has to sense what looms large or sounds loud or produces a fast echo, letting the world do its own computation. Hodgkins uses some heuristics to reduce the number of calculations required, and she does report that on a powerful silicon graphics computer, the simulations go faster than real time, so the problem is not technologically insurmountable. The placement of algorithm calculates a desired velocity based on the positions and velocity of nearby neighbors. Hodgkin's one-legged hoppers are generally able to avoid running into each other, but she reports that they do sometimes collide and are sometimes unable to miss obstacles in their paths. Hodgkins has conducted similar experiments with point masses, that is, populations of particles with no physical properties, and reports that they are more successful at coordinating their movements. This might be because the hopping of one-legged robots introduces somewhat erratic trajectories that are hard to coordinate. Hodgkins and her colleagues have also run populations of simulated bicycle riders, including in their programs all the physical aspects of balancing, elasticity of objects, friction, and so on. The human rider is modeled as a rigid body of 15 segments with movable joints, and the bicycle is likewise realistic. Kirsten Downton-Hahn, 1998, a German researcher now in the UK, has been conducting an intensive program of investigation into many aspects of socially intelligent computational entities, including robots, virtual robots, and lifelike software agents. Her robots interact with humans and with one another, often learning and adapting during the course of the social interaction. Downton-Hahn concludes that embodiment is central to social behavior and intelligence generally. Her research is centered around a set of hypotheses that really amount to a manifesto. Okay, so this embodiment is really important, right? The embodiment is how the models of the robots in the machine get out, and it's much more difficult. They can manage robots better inside the metaverse because it's all computational than when those decision-making processes have to interface with the real world. And I think just as they were talking about that a mind to actually develop as a mind needs social engagement, that you can't have an isolated mind that is isolated from other minds and have it develop in any sort of meaningful way, is that embodiment is central to life, and that the embodiment of robots is really challenging because then it has to deal with real physics. And and figuring out how to do that computation. Okay, so this is Danton Hahn's research. Her ideas about embodiment. Number one, life and intelligence only develops inside a body. Two, which is adapted to the environment that the agent is living in. Three, intelligence can only be studied within a complete system, embedded and coupled with its environment. Number four, intelligence is linked to a social context. All intelligent agents are social beings. So I think these are really important to think about. You need a body. It has to be in an environment. Intelligence of that body has to be looked at systematically with the body coupled to the environment, and then it happens within a social context. And again, just thinking back to some of the stuff I was talking about with the refugee camps, right? Imagine like using sensor technology and programmable money to figure out the embodiment, like in the simulation first. They want to refine it in the simulation first because it's cheaper to do it in there than to come out. And so like us as an armature, as individual armatures, as learning agents, and as social armatures, I feel like this idea of embodiment is really central. She further asserts that social robotics can be characterized by these statements. Oh, the other thing that I think in terms of and this hasn't come up yet, but one of the main robotic engineering programs where I live in Philly is at Penn, is the GRASP Lab. And the GRASP Lab is part of the Penn Engineering Center. And they're focused on teaming, like the robot teaming. And a lot of the work is done through swarm drones. And if you think about that, the biggest challenge is the physics of it. In some ways, organizing teamed drones in the air has less challenges and less obstacles if you're using it in open spaces, which isn't a given. Like you could have it in a forest, which would be much more challenging. But if you're imagining it like over a meadow, something that was unimpeded, it's much easier computationally to bring the embodiment of swarm robotics into a drone simulation than it is like a walking or something that's on ground level terrain. I think that I think that's why so much of the teaming research is being done with drones. And then they need all sorts of, things that they say like that we're going to use the drones to get the impact data for the impact markets, or we're going to use them in disasters or whatever. But I think a lot of this is actually about like developing the teaming systems. Okay, so she further asserts that social robotics can be characterized by these statements, and this is in 1999. Agents are embodied. Agents are individuals, part of heterogeneous groups. The members are not identical, but have individual features like different sensors, different shapes and mechanics. Agents can recognize and interact with each other and engage in social interactions as a prerequisite to developing social relationships. Agents have histories. They perceive and interpret the world in terms of their own experience. And then agents can explicitly communicate with each other. Communication is grounded in imitation and interactions between agents. Meaning is transferred between two agents by sharing the same context. And 6, individual agents contribute to the dynamics of the whole group, as well as the society contributing to the individual. Okay. Danton Hahn allows that the term agent can be used to refer to computational, mechanical, or biological entities, as long as they have some degree of autonomy and can interact with their environment. And I think the embedded in the environment goes back to the UNESCO work, right? And the stuff that the work that Leah was doing with the UNESCO man and the environment. Man is embedded in the environment. It's always to understand the embodiment. You have to have both. Robotic and biological agents, of course, do have a physical body and are embedded in an environment that they can interact with. But what about the software agents? Of course, it is possible to computationally simulate an environment and some corporeal structure. And if the simulation is thorough and precise, then, as with other simulations, the modeled events might perfectly well mimic real physical events. But isn't this cheating? If we have defined our territory in such a way that having a body is a necessary part of it, well, does the simulated body count? Are function inputs and outputs the same as perceptions and motor activities? Danton Hahn asks the questions and proposes an answer. Simulation allows experimentation with alternative embodiments. What aspects of the physics of the real world are necessary for the production of intelligent behavior? What if we stripped out some qualities? For instance, what if collisions were allowed and beings could interpenetrate? What if movement was allowed in 3 or 4 dimensions? These kinds of questions can only be answered in experimentation with simulated beings. Danton Hahn has proposed that social intelligence be defined as the individual's capability to define and manage relationships between individualized autobiographic agents, which, by means of communication, build up shared social interaction structures which help to integrate and manage the individual's basic or selfish interests in relationship to the kinds of the social system's next highest level. She contrasts this kind of social intelligence with swarm intelligence, in particular the kinds of work described above with insect behavior, in which individuals tend to become more or less the same and interactions among them are primitive. She explains that nature has produced 2 kinds of social models, which she calls anonymous and individualized societies. Social insects do not keep track of one another as individuals, but only as group members, while members of individualized societies will search for a missing member. As researchers in the field of robotics search for ways to create a social milieu among their man-made hardware agents, they are forced to work within the constraints of the 3-dimensional physical world. The most important communications have to do with the individual agent's relative positions in space and coordination of movements. When we think of mental life in a social context, that we find that while some of our communications and thoughts have to do with the coordination of movement in physical space, a preponderance of them have to do with seeking agreement on beliefs and attitudes. Agreement means that 2 individuals occupy the same point in cognitive space. Obviously, collision is not an issue here, but something to be desired. Wow, that's really interesting. I don't know if people are still with me. This is the last part that I'm going to read, but I'm going to read this last paragraph again because I think it's interesting how these things always lead into the next talk that I need to do about tokenomics and tokenized democracy. Okay. As researchers in the field of robotics search for ways to create a social milieu among their man-made hardware agents, they are forced to work within the constraints of 3-dimensional physical world. The most important communications have to do with the agent's relative position in space and coordination of movements. But when we think of mental life in a social context, we find that while some of our communication and thoughts have to do with coordination of movements in physical space, a preponderance of them have to do with seeking agreement on beliefs and attitudes. Agreement means that 2 individuals occupy the same point in a cognitive space. Obviously, collisions are not an issue here, but something to be desired. And I will just say, like, this feels really a lot like this work that I was looking at, this combining crowds and machines, where they were essentially talking about democracy as being distributed across these agents, and where the future of electronic governance would be that we would cede participation and representation to an agent that would act on our behalf. And that agent would be a digital agent in cyberspace. And that if you think about what Melanie Swan has been saying about these cloud minds and entering into communal spaces with living and non-living things, essentially it would be like, okay, on a given day, here's a list within the intergovernmental authority of hundreds of things that will be decided collectively through tokenization. And, you're busy doing your telerobotic gig work over here, but you've authorized an agent to act on your behalf in this collective cloud mind of consciousness. I feel like that's sort of what they're talking about. And that the physics of that has to happen in the metaverse. Like it can't actually happen. But there's a linkage between the embodiment to an actual human who's tethered to physical reality, material reality, because they need that embodiment, but they want the delegation for the efficiency of the social agreement. So I don't know if anyone who's still here, if that makes sense to you, but that's the thing I want to talk about next, is spend more time on this new forms of democracy. So I guess I guess that we're at the end of that. So till next time, thanks so much for joining in. All right. Bye-bye.